Chapter 1889. I'm still me in the other timeline. I don't think I'll find a cultivation partner. Be careful, little girl, the other timeline's Empyrean said flatly. Hearing this, Luo Fan just shook his head and didn't say anything. He knew that it wasn't that the woman didn't want to admit that he was her Tao companion from another timeline. She was just expressing her attitude. Of course, Luo Fan didn't want her to admit it. He was just stating a fact. There are some things that you can't change no matter what, he said flatly. The woman's expression kept changing. After a while, she let out a long sigh and said, "Where is my other timeline right now?" Luo Fan said flatly, "She's not in this world." "Oh, it seems like she didn't have the same experience as me." The woman's expression was a little strange. She seemed to be glad, but also a little disappointed. Then, she was shocked and said, "What about you? Since you're her cultivation partner, why are you here?" Luo Fan smiled inexplicably. Although she was the Empyrean in a different timeline, the relationship between the two couldn't be severed. The woman was clearly disdainful before, but she immediately started to care about his other self in the other timeline. Then, he said, "I'm just a doppelganger now. My main body is still with her." Doppelganger? The woman's eyes flashed slightly. Luo Fan sensed that something was wrong with her aura. He couldn't help but frown and said, "You seem to be planning something. Since you're a doppelganger, and this is a completely different world, then you must be independent now. Then, how I treat you shouldn't affect your main body, right?" she said with a smile. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly laughed. "It seems like you haven't realized it yet." The woman's misunderstanding was obviously because she didn't know the magic of the world and didn't understand it. After sorting out one's own unique worldview, when this worldview grew to a certain stage, the chaotic state would no longer be an obstacle to the spiritual connection. It would no longer allow its avatar to leave that perfect world and sever its connection with it. It would become an independent clone. Without finding his own unique worldview, he was able to grow to this level, and in the end, he was able to be on par with Luo Fan. She even seemed to be suppressing him. This made him even more curious about the cultivation path of the empty maiden in this alternate timeline. "You didn't comprehend anything?" The woman frowned when she heard this. Her eyes flashed with doubt. Naturally, Luo Fan had no interest in dispelling her doubts. It was not only because sorting out his unique view of the world was the key to his cultivation, and he could not easily reveal it. More importantly, even though the woman before him was a void lady from another timeline, she was only from another timeline. To him, she was not a real air hostess at all. She was not his Tao companion. Under such circumstances, the two of them could be said to be strangers. He would not even tell her about some ordinary mysteries, let alone the key mysteries of cultivation. Therefore, he just said, "It's nothing." The woman frowned. An inexplicable sense of irritation surged in her heart. Originally, with her attainments in the spiritual world, she would not be so easily provoked by others. However, this person's strength was a level higher than hers. Moreover, he had an unclear relationship with her from another timeline. This identity was clearly completely different to her. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easier for him to leave a mark in her heart than others, and he could naturally change her emotions more easily. "Then let me directly search your memory. What you said just now was just your one-sided statement," the woman said calmly. As she spoke, countless runes appeared on her body, and in an instant, the space-time within a radius of 10 light-years was completely sealed. Everything within the space-time within a radius of 10 light-years was completely replaced by the runes, turning this place into a world of runes. This kind of world of runes was not just a normal world of runes that was formed by runes. Instead, it was a true world of runes, where even the rules and laws, as well as the great Tao behind it, were completely replaced by runes. In such a world of runes, living beings were even born. There were even living beings that began to comprehend the great Tao of runes and began to absorb the runes around them. They gradually improved and evolved themselves, giving birth to an increasingly prosperous rune cultivation civilization. This kind of situation could only appear in a real world. It seems that you've already made preparations. Seeing this, Luo Fan frowned. At this moment, specks of spiritual light appeared on his body and began to form a defensive layer. It gradually isolated the surrounding runes, causing no runes to be able to approach him within a certain range. At this moment, he was in an indescribable void. I'll let you see my cultivation achievements over the years. After transmigrating to this world for so many epochs, it would be a big mistake for you to estimate my strength based on another timeline, the woman said calmly. Currently, he appeared to be unprecedentedly calm, as if everything was already in his hands. The space-time formed by the entire world of runes was extremely stable, and the laws of runes were extremely powerful. At this moment, it was like black ink that continuously spread towards the spiritual light around Luo Fan's body and eroded it, causing the spiritual light to be transformed into runes bit by bit. They gradually melted into the surrounding world of runes, becoming a part of this world of runes. These spiritual lights were condensed by Luo Fan with the infinite power in his body. Every speck of spiritual light was equivalent to having a direct connection with his mind. At this moment, these spiritual lights were being eroded by the runes bit by bit and changed bit by bit. The entire process was clearly reflected in his heart, and he could clearly sense it, allowing him to directly understand every single detail. He could even vaguely see the cultivation path of the woman. This isn't the path of runes at all. This is simply the path of spacetime. Luo Fan suddenly spoke after a long time. His words made the woman's expression change suddenly. For a moment, there was an indescribable light in his eyes. It seemed to be surprise, amazement, admiration, and even more so, realization. I didn't expect you to be able to see through it, she said faintly after a while. These runes seemed to be some indescribably mysterious runes, but in fact, the foundation of these runes was time and space. Every rune was formed by countless times of time and space in an indescribable way. The structure of each rune was many times more complicated than it seemed on the surface. It could be said that the rune world formed by the endless runes was, in fact, a world formed by endless time and space in a specific way. This and the higher space-time dimension. They actually achieved the same result through different means. It was no wonder that these seemingly mysterious runes could actually have such great power. They could actually support this woman's strength to such an unbelievable level. It's also because I have a cultivation partner that I can see through it. Luo Fan sighed. With a slight thought, the specks of spiritual light around his body began to undergo a subtle change. As this subtle change occurred, the spiritual light seemed to suddenly become insulated. No matter how the surrounding runes changed, no matter how it changed, they could no longer leave any marks on it, let alone transform and devour it. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, ordinary things. As long as one understood its essence, one would naturally be able to find countless ways to deal with it. Only a mystery that it could not understand could affect it and harm it. But now, Luo Fan had already understood the fundamental essence of this woman's cultivation path. Naturally, her methods would not work on him. Of course, he knew that this was only temporary. After all, this woman had already reached his level, and her methods would definitely not be limited to this level. She must have more and more mysterious tricks up her sleeves. I didn't expect it to come from her. The woman sighed. Although the essence of her cultivation had been comprehended by her opponent and she had fallen into an absolute disadvantage, the woman was not worried at all. Her expression was still the same as before, calm and composed. This kind of performance had obviously confirmed Luo Fan's thoughts. Sure enough, she still had a stronger and more mysterious means. Back then, the Space Maiden was born with some kind of innate ability related to spacetime. This innate ability became less and less useful later on, and the Space Maiden had even directly abandoned it when she sorted out her view of the world. However, this was a connection that was extremely close to him. In another timeline, the Space Maiden had derived her own cultivation path from this ability, and in the end, she had pushed it to an unimaginable height. Clearly, it was reasonable for her to cultivate to this stage. At this moment, Luo Fan was no longer in the mood to be imprisoned in the world of runes by the other party. With a thought, a simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light rushed out from his body. Like a long river, it stretched across the entire world of runes, causing the world of runes to emit cracking sound. Countless cracks spread from the long river, gradually splitting the world of runes into countless fragments. The simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light was formed based on one's own understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. The higher one's cultivation realm, the clearer one's understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. The simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light would naturally be more similar to the connate inextinguishable spirit light, and its power would naturally be stronger. The current Luo Fan was already tens of thousands of times stronger than when he had been in the imperfect perfect world. In this way, his understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light was naturally many times stronger than before. In this way, the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that he simulated was clearly unimaginable. It was clearly the first time that the Space Maiden in another timeline had encountered the simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light. At that moment, her eyes flickered, and there was an indescribable excitement in her eyes. The simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light was an existence that transcended space-time. The process of destroying the entire world of runes was extremely complicated, and it was filled with endless changes and mysteries. However, on the surface, it seemed that the entire world of runes had collapsed as soon as it appeared. The entire process was so straightforward that it made one wonder if there had really been a terrifying world of runes here before. This simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light didn't stop there. After that, it spun around. After that, it swept towards the Space Maiden in another timeline, wanting to devour her. At that moment, a rune ring appeared on the Space Maiden's body. A primal chaos aura was released from the runic ring. Following the appearance of this chaotic aura, pitch-black tribulation clouds gradually condensed in the sky. The Space Maiden in another timeline frowned at this moment, and she raised her head to look at the sky in dissatisfaction. Then, she did something. The chaotic aura that was released from the rune ring had been completely restrained, and the ring looked like an extremely ordinary rune ring. Following this change, the terrifying tribulation clouds that had appeared in the sky began to gradually disperse, and before long, they had disappeared without a trace. The simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light had already collided with the ring brazenly. Without a sound, the space-time within a radius of 10 light-years was completely annihilated. Even the laws were broken at this moment, and it seemed like they were about to be completely destroyed. They were completely destroyed, and it seemed like they were about to be completely destroyed. The instant the rune ring and the simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light collided, they released the infinite power contained within them. At that moment, the rune ring had already collapsed bit by bit, turning into runes that wrapped around the Space Maiden in another timeline like smoke. The simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light that Luo Fan had released had also collapsed, turning into specks of spiritual light. In other words, the specks of worlds had spread out in the surroundings, making up for the space-time within a radius of 10 light-years that had been formed by the annihilation of space-time. Although the world wasn't perfect, it wasn't broken. The self-recovery ability of the laws was not inferior to any perfect world. At that moment, after a large portion of the laws had been broken, the self-recovery mechanism naturally took effect. It began to twist and squirm, trying its best to glue the broken parts back together. During this process, Luo Fan's innate inextinguishable spiritual light, or in other words, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, or in other words, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was situated between the laws and laws. It blocked the laws and laws from fusing back together and recovering. As a result, the laws and laws naturally linked the spiritual light with the laws and laws, making the spiritual light specks a part of the laws and laws. As a result, the spiritual light specks that Luo Fan did not intend to leave in this void for too long solidified and gradually became a part of this world, becoming a certain landscape of this world. Even Luo Fan could not easily erase it and restore this place to its original state. How did this world become like this? The Space Maiden in another timeline looked around. Although her expression was calm, her tone was filled with disbelief. To her, although the Earth was the universe that had given birth to her and raised her, she had spent almost 99% of her time in this part of the world. Hence, compared to Earth, she had more feelings for this world. She felt that this world was her home even more. She was originally extremely powerful and stable, and she gave others the feeling that she was at the absolute peak and extreme of this world. But now, she had actually fallen to the point of absorbing the methods of such cultivators to promote her own growth. It was simply like watching her father, who was originally a billionaire, actually become a beggar one day, begging on the side of the road. It went without saying how unacceptable that feeling was. Clearly, Luo Fan did not feel that way. Instead, he felt an indescribable sense of helplessness. Fellow Taoist, we are in the middle of a battle now. Can you focus? When the Space Maiden in another timeline heard this, she waved her hand and said, "I'm not in the mood anymore." As she spoke, she did not hesitate to absorb the smoke-like runes around her into her body, leaving her defenseless. She no longer had any defenses and appeared among the countless spiritual lights around Luo Fan. At the sight of this, Luo Fan could only sigh and stop his attack. Although this was the first time he had met this woman, she was a Space Maiden in another timeline, after all. This kind of relationship was many times closer than the relationship between sisters. In a situation where it was not absolutely necessary, he could not bring himself to attack her. It was obvious that this woman had seen through this and knew that as long as she did not take the initiative to attack, Luo Fan would not be too harsh on her, which was why she did not mind and did not put up any defenses in front of Luo Fan. Chapter 1890. At this moment, the air hostess in the other timeline only smiled faintly. She did not express any complacency or displeasure. What exactly happened back then? Why did it shatter the world into such a state? Luo Fan did not care and asked directly. Hearing this, the lady seemed to be in a daze as if she was thinking about something. After a while, she said, "To be honest, I don't know." "You don't know? Wasn't the world still intact when you first came? You experienced the whole process. How could you not know what exactly happened?" Luo Fan frowned. The air hostess in the other timeline glanced at Luo Fan and said, "What's so strange about that?" The air hostess from another timeline glanced at Luo Fan and said, "What's so strange about that? Back then, I was thousands of times weaker than I am now. How could I know what happened between true sages? Back then, I was thousands of times weaker than I am now. How could I know what happened between true sages? To me, it was just one day when the world suddenly shook, and everything I knew fell into absolute turmoil. After that, the world collapsed, and the area I was in was thrown out into the primal chaos." Hearing this, Luo Fan was stunned and could only smile bitterly. He could not refute what the lady said. What she said was completely logical and in line with reality. The existence of true sages was an existence of another world as compared to those who were below true sages like them. Even though he felt that he was close to true sages now. Even though he had already used the heaven and earth's will to experience what it felt like to raise his own will level to the true sage stage, He was still completely clueless about what the true sage stage was. He could not understand the existence of true sages at all. Even if a true sage was standing in front of him, he might not see or hear anything under such circumstances. Back then, she would not know what exactly happened. That was only natural. It's a pity. I wanted to understand more. In the end, he could only sigh. It's not impossible to understand. Existences at our level might not be able to understand it, but some existences can, Space Maiden from another timeline suddenly said. These words made Luo Fan vigilant. What do you mean? Aren't you curious as to why we, the fragments of the world, are still able to exist after being thrown into the primal chaos? Moreover, we are able to return and fuse back into this world? Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, asked. I am indeed a little curious. Luo Fan did not hide his true feelings. This matter was indeed true. It was already piled up in his heart, making him feel extremely curious. After all, even the great world had been shattered to such an extent. Logically speaking, those large fragments might be able to survive in the state of chaos with their own strength and wouldn't be eroded and destroyed by the state of chaos. However, that was only for the larger fragments. Those smaller fragments definitely couldn't do it. But the reality was obviously different. Even a small existence like the Chaos Planet could survive in the state of chaos. Moreover, since ancient times, among the fragments that fell from the sky, there were fragments that were even smaller than the Chaos Planet. All of this indicated that there was a secret. In fact, the reason why those fragments could survive in the chaos and return and fuse back is because there is a power that is controlling everything. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, said something that made Luo Fan feel incredulous. What? He frowned and said, could it be a true divine treasure? That's impossible. I don't know if it's a true divine treasure. I only know that according to my countless eras of research, there is a power that is different from that of cultivators in the fragment that I am in. It is protecting everything and vaguely guiding the fragment in a certain direction. It was only until I fell into a deep sleep that it gradually subsided. Luo Fan was a little confused. After a while, he said, So, what does this have to do with what you said about wanting to know what happened back then? I have studied that power for so long, and I have long sensed that power. As long as we can find the source of that power, it is very likely that we will be able to analyze all the information we want to know. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, had an inexplicable look of excitement on her face. You mean that the source of that power is in this world? Luo Fan frowned. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, could not help but change her expression. She did not expect Luo Fan to be so quick-witted. She had only made a start, and he had already guessed it. When Luo Fan saw the change in Space Maiden's expression, how could he not know that he had guessed correctly? It seems that it is indeed so. At first glance, this kind of speculation seemed very magical, but in fact, it was extremely simple for Luo Fan to guess it. Space Maiden said that she could find the source of that power, which meant that the power must be in a place where it could be reached. If the power was in a state of chaos, with their current strength and level, how could they get close to it and obtain that power? With a slight deduction from this, he naturally understood that the power was definitely in this world. How about it? Do you want to go with me? Space Maiden did not continue to explain and only asked. Of course. After all, I am just a clone. Luo Fan said calmly. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, frowned and said, We are both smart people, so why do you still pretend? You are separated from the chaos of your main body. Haven't you obtained independence? Why do you still think of yourself as a clone? There are some things that you don't know. Luo Fan only smiled. He did not explain in detail. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, furrowed her brows even more. But obviously, she could not say much and could only put this matter aside. Let's go, we need to find more companions, Space Maiden said. Oh? All of them are in the Hollow Mountain Range? Luo Fan was curious. Although it had experienced all sorts of impact, many were destroyed, but the Hollow Mountain Range was only scarred on the surface. Its internal structure was extremely stable and powerful. Until now, there were not many changes. Therefore, Luo Fan did not find it strange that there were still some hidden powerhouses inside. Of course. However, I don't know if she survived, the alternate timelines airmaid said. As she spoke, she turned around and headed down the Hollow Mountain Range. Luo Fan looked at it, his eyes revealing a look of anticipation. As she headed down, at this moment, the numerous specks of light had already been completely fused with the laws and had completely fused with the laws of this world. They fused with the world and turned into a natural landscape of this world, becoming the many subsidiary small worlds of this world. Such a change made this place look dazzling. From afar, it was as if there were countless stars twinkling here. But from a closer look, one would not be able to see anything, at least, from the perspective of ordinary living beings. That was how it was. This natural landscape made this area seem so special, so mysterious, and even vaguely mysterious. The Empyrean maiden from a different timeline took Luo Fan around and directly arrived at the core of a certain Hollow Mountain Range. If this place was in the original world, it would be the core of the Chaos Planet. This area was also formed by arc-shaped stone pillars. The place where Air Maiden appeared with Luo Fan in a different timeline was at the top of a certain arc-shaped stone pillar. Luo Fan had never been here before. According to his plan, he would need at least a few years before he could come here and investigate everything. Sure enough, there's something hidden here. Luo Fan suddenly had an epiphany when he stepped on the stone pillar. Under his feet there was some kind of extremely obscure fluctuation. These ripples were so mysterious, as if they contained all the profundities and principles of the universe. Just their existence alone had vaguely stirred up the boundless laws in the surroundings, causing them to ignore this place. This place was almost out of the control of this world, out of the perception of this world. For Luo Fan, this kind of situation was obviously extraordinary. Something's not right, the air hostess in the alternate timeline murmured at this moment. Luo Fan frowned slightly. At this time, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline didn't pay much attention to Luo Fan. She stood there, and with a thought, she condensed both of her hands. With a wave of her hands, countless runes surged out from her hands and turned into 7 colors in the void. Like a rainbow, they brazenly poured into the stone pillar below Luo Fan's feet. As the countless runes poured in, the stone pillar began to tremble. The trembling was extremely weak at first, as if it did not exist and was difficult to detect. But as time passed, the trembling became more and more obvious and intense. In the end, it even produced a loud buzzing sound that spread far away. Fortunately, after the many changes just now, there were no longer any living beings in the vicinity. Therefore, although the buzzing sound was shocking, it did not attract much attention. Only Luo Fan and Empyrean from a different timeline saw all of this. Even if Luo Fan was confident that he wouldn't be affected, he wouldn't stand on the stone pillar and endure the changes. At this moment, however, he was already floating in midair, looking down at the changes happening below. At this moment, the trembling of the stone pillar below had reached an extreme. Suddenly, countless cracks appeared on the stone pillar and began to spread in all directions. Gradually, the entire stone pillar was enveloped by the cracks, and the cracks continued to expand. Then, unknowingly, the stone pillar was completely destroyed, and countless fragments fell to the ground. Only the one in the middle, below Luo Fan and the air hostess from the alternate timeline, the stone pillar was still hovering in midair, as if there was an invisible force holding it in place, preventing it from falling. Facing such a change, the expression of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline changed slightly. She seemed to be looking forward to it, but also a little worried. Luo Fan saw it. His heart was filled with curiosity. What was the relationship between that existence and this space maiden from a different timeline? Could it be that it was her cultivation companion? As this thought flashed through his mind, his expression couldn't help but become a little strange. At this moment, the space maiden in the alternate timeline obviously didn't have the mood to pay attention to Luo Fan. She was only paying attention to the changes happening below. The stone pillar under her feet kept shattering. The scene was so shocking that it was really indescribable. Even the section of the stone pillar directly below Luo Fan was no exception. At this moment it was also shattering. Bits and pieces of the shattered stone pillar kept falling. All of them continued to fall, leaving only the remnants hovering in the air, motionless. As the shattering continued, the remaining matter became less and less. In the end, only a thumb-sized bead was still there, and the fluctuation that Luo Fan could faintly sense was precisely coming from this small bead. At this moment, the expression of the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline had already become extremely ugly. She raised her head to look at the sky. The sky didn't change at all, let alone the tribulation cloud when she first appeared. Even the abnormal fluctuation of the Ren River in the air didn't appear at all. In this situation, even if Luo Fan didn't know what exactly was in the bead, he could tell that something must have gone wrong. At this moment, crack, 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 cracking sounds could be heard coming from the bead. Although this shattering sound was extremely light, it sounded as loud as thunder in the ears of Luo Fan and Air Hostess, who were in a different timeline, causing their complexions to change greatly for a moment. Then, a faint brilliance leaked out of the bead. At the sight of this, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly became excited. The cracking sounds continued, and the intervals between them became shorter and shorter. The sound also became louder and louder. In the end, it even turned into a thunderous sound that shook the surrounding void, causing the surroundings to faintly produce more and more obvious fluctuations. At this moment, the wind and clouds surged in the sky, and vaguely, the tribulation cloud was gradually forming. Seeing this, Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, relaxed as if everything had passed. This situation was simply a replica of the time when she returned. This clearly meant that although there were some problems with the existence below that she was looking for, there were generally no irreversible changes. Something's not right. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. However, he could sense that the tribulation cloud above was not really forming. Instead, it was dispersing. There seemed to be only one possibility in this situation. That was, the existence that had drawn the tribulation cloud might not have enough strength to truly form the tribulation cloud. In fact, even drawing the tribulation cloud earlier could be considered as its all-out effort. Luo Fan didn't care about it, so he could see it clearly. However, on the other hand, the Space Maiden in the alternate timeline was blinded by the matter because it was related to her, so she couldn't see it clearly. At this moment, she only had joy and anticipation in her heart. At this moment, the tribulation cloud in the sky began to dissipate slowly, and the sky gradually became clear again. The Space Maiden in the alternate timeline finally noticed this situation. At that moment, her expression changed drastically. She lifted her foot and took a step forward. Her figure crossed space-time and appeared directly in front of the bead. She raised her hand and grabbed the bead. In an instant, her expression became extremely ugly. As her power surged, endless runes emerged from her body and poured into the bead in her hand. The bead was like a bottomless black hole. It didn't reject the runes that poured into it at all. It devoured everything without leaving anything out. This process lasted for 10 days and 10 nights. After 10 days and 10 nights, the bead finally stopped absorbing runes. The Space Maiden in the alternate timeline finally stopped. However, her expression was still solemn, and her eyes were filled with worry. Seems like there's something wrong with your partner's backup plan. How is it? Can it recover? Luo Fan asked calmly. The Space Maiden in the alternate timeline sighed and said, I didn't expect that I'd be fine outside, but something would happen to her when she's hidden deep inside. Her brand is now incomplete. Although I've stabilized it, I can't make it whole again. Even if I resurrect her now, she won't be the same as before. When Luo Fan heard this, he suddenly understood what was going on. He couldn't help but sigh and say, if the brand is incomplete, it might be possible to repair it if it's weak. However, she's at least on par with us. This is no longer something that we can repair. The Space Maiden in the alternate timeline frowned. She seemed to be unable to make up her mind. After a while, she sighed and raised her hand to throw the bead in her hand forward. Then, she raised her hand and slapped it hard. In an instant, an indescribably terrifying power poured into the bead. As the power poured into the bead, it suddenly collapsed and turned into countless fragments that flew in all directions. Chapter 1891. At that moment, the empty lady in the alternate timeline lifted her hand and waved it in the air. The endless rules and laws around her began to surge, and waves of mysterious power were born out of thin air. They surged into the mysterious brand and turned into a part of the brand, causing the brand to squirm slowly. A part of the brand slowly spread out from the broken parts, gradually filling up the missing parts. When he saw this, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. This action seemed to be repairing the brand, allowing it to return to its original state. However, that was only a facade. In truth, the brand that was repaired was no longer the original brand. It was no longer the original brand, and the living being that the brand represented was naturally no longer the same living being. Instead, it had become a completely different person. Perhaps this person still had traces of the previous person, but at most, she could only be considered a descendant. The empty lady in the alternate timeline was fully focused at that moment. All sorts of lights flashed madly in her eyes, and the ripples of her thoughts leaked out from her body. It shook the spacetime around her faintly, causing it to change slightly, as if it had become a part of her thoughts. With one look, Luo Fan knew that she wasn't just trying to make up for the imprint. After all, with the empty lady in the alternate timeline's strength, even though she would need to spend a lot of effort to repair the brand, it would not make her lose her composure like this. The most likely thing that would happen would be for her expression to remain unchanged, and she would just swipe her hand casually to complete everything. Now, it was clear that she wanted to bestow more things to this brand. Or rather, she wanted to restore the brand to the appearance of the companion in her memories. What you're doing is useless. After a long while, Luo Fan could not help but speak up. His words caused the empty lady in the alternate timeline to shudder. After a long while, she sighed faintly and said, "That's right. There's no meaning in doing this. Even though I'm very familiar with her, I'm not her in the end. The path I cultivate isn't the path she cultivates either. If I give this new brand to her in my memories, I'll end her path of cultivation in the future." As she sighed, her expression became extremely bitter. Following this change, the fluctuations of her thoughts slowly converged, and the power that was born out of thin air around her also increased. The quality became higher and higher, and the speed at which it entered the mark also became faster and faster. In the end, the speed at which the brand was mended became faster and faster. Previously, it might have taken a few days to complete this complicated and mysterious imprint, but now, it only took a few dozen breaths. Dozens of breaths later, when everything calmed down, the brand had completely appeared in front of Luo Fan and Air Maiden in a different timeline. The imprint left the control of Empyrean, who was in a different timeline, and began to tremble slightly in the void. At this moment, the boundless laws and laws in the surroundings began to gradually disperse. They were replicated one by one and slowly fused into the mark, causing it to slowly transform and grow. It did not take long before the countless laws and laws that were replicated turned into a source of life, and it grew into a spirit. After this spirit was formed, it seemed to have triggered some kind of mysterious mechanism. An endless amount of energy began to surge out from it in a crazy manner. Gradually, it weaved itself into a graceful body around it. It was a woman. A young woman who seemed to be around 14 or 15 years old. At this moment, her body was curled up into a ball, as if she was waiting to be born in a mother's womb. A heartbeat that ranged from weak to loud constantly rang out from her body, faintly resonating with the world around her. As a connection was formed, a mysterious power slowly seeped out of the world and slowly poured into the woman's body, gradually causing her aura to rise rapidly from zero. In the end, the woman barely managed to raise her aura to the connate grand Luo realm, but she no longer had the strength to go any further. She just stopped there. The woman's heartbeat gradually slowed down, and the mysterious power that was constantly pouring into her body from the surroundings began to fade as well. It did not take long before it completely disappeared. At this moment, the woman's body slowly stretched out, and her eyes slowly opened. There was absolute purity and innocence in her eyes, as well as an unimaginable ignorance in the eyes of a connate grand Luo realm cultivator. She has no memories at all. At this moment, Luo Fan understood. The first thing the woman saw when she woke up was Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline. Her eyes instantly lit up, and she pounced forward and hugged Luo Fan. She said, "Daddy. Mommy." The sudden change shocked Luo Fan. He was stunned on the spot. He did not expect the woman's first words to be, "Who are you? Why am I here? Who am I?" And so on and so forth, but he had never thought that the first thing he said would actually be this. The empty maiden from a different timeline smiled bitterly at this moment and said, "We're not your daddy and mommy." The woman did not listen to this, and she kept rubbing her face against Luo Fan's chest while calling him daddy with great satisfaction. The empty maiden from a different timeline could only sigh and say no more when she saw this scene. As for the cliché of having feelings for Luo Fan just because she and Luo Fan called each other mommy and daddy, it was naturally impossible for that to happen to her, and it was even more impossible for it to happen to Luo Fan. After all, both of them were extremely powerful existences that had completely comprehended their own hearts, and there were no flaws in their hearts since a long time ago. Such a change that was extremely likely to happen to mortals would not happen to them. Luo Fan sighed and said, "What other memories do you have?" "I don't have any. I only know that you're my daddy and she's my mommy," the woman said in Luo Fan's arms. Luo Fan felt helpless. He turned to look at the empty maiden from a different timeline and asked, "What's her name?" "Her name?" The empty maiden from a different timeline looked a little startled at this moment. After a while, she said, "She used to be called Hun Jing. However, that's just her in the past. She's no longer the same person as before." Hun Jing. Luo Fan muttered in his heart and continued. "How about calling her Hun Jing now? It's also good for you." "No, no. I don't want to be called Hun Jing. I don't want to be called Hun Jing." The woman in Luo Fan's arms had already objected wantonly. "Why?" The empty maiden from a different timeline could not help but frown slightly. Although it was not necessary for her to be called Hun Jing, she felt inexplicably unhappy when she saw that the woman rejected this name so much. "That's someone else's name. I don't want to be someone else's name. I want a new name," the woman said matter-of-factly. Hearing this, the empty maiden from a different timeline was a little startled. She was a little regretful that she had to recreate this woman at this moment. At this time, Luo Fan quite understood the woman in front of him who called him father. After all, she was no longer the Hun Jing from before. The relationship between her and Hun Jing could be said to be that of an inheritor, or a descendant, or a reincarnation. No matter what, she was indeed a different person. Under such circumstances, if she was still regarded as Hun Jing, it would be a denial of her new life. That was a denial of her new life. How could she be willing? "Forget it then. You can call me whatever you want." The empty maiden from a different timeline sighed and said helplessly. Hearing this, the woman looked at Luo Fan expectantly and said, "Father, can you give me a name? I want to follow your surname." Luo Fan suddenly felt happy and said, "There's no need to follow my surname. After all, you were born from the foundation of Hunjing, so you can be considered her descendant. Why don't you follow her surname now?" "I'll listen to everything you say, father." The woman was very easy to talk to at this moment. She did not have the strong objection from before. Hearing this, Luo Fan thought about it and said, "Why don't we call you Hunku? How about Hunku?" "Hunku? Alright, I'll be called Hunku." The woman pondered for a while, and was quite satisfied with this name. She said with an indescribable joy on her face. Following her words, a thunderous roar was heard. This thunderous roar spread through the boundless void of this world. It reached the ears of all living beings in this world, making them feel that some inexplicable change had occurred in this world. At this moment, Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline were shocked. They could not help but look up at the sky. This is the birth of the main character of this world? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Then, he suddenly lowered his head and looked at Hunku in his arms. The woman who called him father. Hunku blinked her innocent and pure eyes and looked at Luo Fan. She looked like an extremely cute pet and did not have the aura of the main character of this world at all. The empty maiden from a different timeline was also a little confused. After looking at the sky, she also looked at Hunku. At this moment, Hunku said in a daze, "Father, mother, why are you looking at me like that?" "It's nothing." Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline said at the same time. Then, the empty maiden from a different timeline suddenly said, "How much longer do you want to hug?" Luo Fan shrugged and pushed Hunku away. At this moment, the empty maiden from a different timeline stepped forward and pulled Hunku back. She sighed and said, "Come on, I'll teach you some general knowledge first." Hunku nodded and said, "Okay, mother." Although she was a little dissatisfied with leaving her father's embrace, it was naturally fine with her mother by her side. Hearing this, the empty maiden from a different timeline raised her eyebrows, but she did not continue to dwell on this form of address. Luo Fan could see that Hunku had become the main character of this world and would experience all kinds of unimaginable things. How could she not see it? Since she knew that she would encounter many dangers and obtain many opportunities, she naturally had to be nurtured well. As for the power that controlled and protected the many fragments of this world, it could only be put aside for now. After all, that power was extremely powerful and its defense was extremely terrifying. Even without Hunku dragging them down, with her and Luo Fan's strength, it was already a little difficult. Now that there was Hunku, there was no need to even think about it. "Is there no one else here?" Before leaving, Luo Fan asked. "There are no more companions." The empty maiden from a different timeline sighed and said, "If there are no companions, then there are enemies?" Luo Fan thought in his heart, but he did not speak again. That was why he was willing to give Hunku a name. It meant that Hunku's status in his heart was already different from others. Under such circumstances, looking for other powerhouses naturally became secondary. Moreover, that was the enemy of the empty maiden from a different timeline. Based on her attitude, it was unlikely that she would provide help. Instead, it was highly possible that she would destroy the backup plan. Therefore, the best solution now was of course to leave without caring about anything. In any case, if the backup plan was really in good condition, then, even without Luo Fan's help, they would still be able to come back to life. If the backup plan was ineffective, then it was highly possible that they would have another daughter or son. Thinking of this, Luo Fan became even more determined to leave. Although the empty maiden from a different timeline had spent a lot more time in this world than Luo Fan, this world had gone through countless changes after all. It was completely different from before. Under such circumstances, relatively speaking, Luo Fan was more familiar with this side of the world. Therefore, the task of finding a place to stay was given to Luo Fan. Soon, Luo Fan had found a plain with an excellent natural environment. There were many powerful beings here, and there were many battles between them as they fought for territory. And it was a sign that a settlement was going to be built. To nurture Hunku, who was the protagonist of this world, it was obviously impossible to nurture her like a cultivator. She could not be confined in a cave residence and nurtured. Instead, she should be allowed to come into contact with other living beings and learn about them as much as possible. Therefore, building a settlement. That was obviously the best choice. The reason why this plane was valued by so many living beings was because there was a huge spirit vein underground here. The existence of this spirit vein could bring endless resources. It was a wonderful place for living beings who could not be self-sufficient. When Luo Fan and the rest arrived, there were already tens of thousands of lifeforms fighting on a huge node of the spiritual vein. There were thousands of lifeforms' corpses lying on the ground. The scene was extremely bloody, and there was an indescribable ominous aura being emitted from it. Seeing this, Luo Fan and the empty maiden from a different timeline did not react at all. They naturally did not have any sympathy for the deaths of billions of living beings that they could easily create. However, even if they could do that, Hunku could not. Seeing this scene, his complexion turned slightly pale, and he grabbed Luo Fan's hand, his body trembling slightly. Just as Luo Fan was about to comfort her, she suddenly said, "Daddy, can we help them? I don't want to see them fighting anymore." Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Her words were like the Virgin Mary, but they did seem to have the aura of a protagonist. Immediately, he looked at the empty maiden from a different timeline, only to see her nodding nonchalantly. Since Space Maiden from an alternate timeline was already in such a state, he naturally did not hesitate any longer. With a thought, his aura spread out and instantly pressed down. In the blink of an eye, the many living beings fighting below were completely suppressed. All of them could no longer move. They could only feel a boundless fear surging out from their hearts. It was as if the entire world had become the worst hell for them, causing them to even lose the ability to think. Luo Fan casually waved his hand. All the corpses below were completely turned into nothingness, fusing with the void and disappearing without a trace. Then, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The leaders who were fighting were pulled up out of thin air and appeared before them. These leaders were all at the Khanate Grand Luo level, and were considered the strongest here. However, even Hunku, who had just been born, could easily crush them like ant. The 8 leaders were able to gather so many living beings to help them fight, so their intelligence was naturally extraordinary. When they saw Luo Fan and the others, they knew that the situation was no longer under their control. They immediately knelt before Luo Fan and the others and quickly said, "What orders do you have, Exalted One? This lowly one will do anything." "Why are you fighting?" Hunku asked. The 8 leaders looked conflicted. What kind of beings were they? Why were they so naive? What other reason could there be? Of course, it was because of benefits. "Well, it's for the spirit vein below," one of the leaders answered carefully. "Aren't you already self-sufficient? Why do you still need the spirit vein?" Hunku became even more curious. Chapter 1892. Although we don't need the spirit veins, our subordinates and disciples all need them. As long as we have the spirit veins, we'll be able to quickly nurture enough powerhouses. By then, it'll be very convenient for us to fight for resources and other things," said one of the leaders. Hunku seemed to have come to a sudden realization when she heard that. "Aren't you guys just wasting time like this? The time spent on nurturing others isn't even enough for you to cultivate diligently. Won't you be able to improve faster this way?" At this moment, the leaders all had bitter smiles in their eyes. There must be thousands of curses running through their minds right now. This is you, all right? Don't judge others based on your own aptitude. Perhaps that's what cultivation is to you. You'll be able to ascend quickly after cultivating in seclusion. But for existences like us, we might not be able to make any progress even if we cultivate for hundreds of thousands of years. If that's the case, is there a need to say which is better or worse if we nurture other living beings to become innate Grand Luo to help us cultivate? However, they clearly could not say that out loud due to the current circumstances. They could only express it tactfully that it was more efficient for them to nurture others to help them. Hun Ku, on the other hand, was interested in everything. After understanding that, she changed the topic and began to ask about other details. She even asked why she was wearing such clothes, why she was using such weapons, and so on. The series of questions lasted for 10 days and 10 nights. In the end, the leaders even felt that all of their secrets had been dug out by Hun Ku, and they all felt an inexplicable sense of exhaustion. In the end, when Hun Ku was finally satisfied and told Luo Fan that she had no more problems, they all felt as if a lifetime had passed. 10 days and 10 nights. For existences at their level, it was just a matter of closing and opening their eyes. Normally, they would not feel tired at all. However, Hun Ku's questioning method was like a mental interrogation. To them, every question was like a blow to their souls. It would be strange if they did not feel tired. Well, since you don't have any questions, let's get started. Luo Fan laughed. At this moment, the others were confused. Luo Fan had no intention of explaining. He pointed downwards, and in the blink of an eye, countless runes surged out of his hand and merged with the surrounding space-time. Slowly, it stirred up the surrounding energy, the surrounding power, and even the surrounding laws, starting to produce some kind of subtle and mysterious change. Shortly after, the runes continued to press down, gradually fusing with the ground below, causing the land to undergo various changes. In the end, these runes reached the huge spirit vein below. It directly seeped into the spirit vein, causing the circulation of the spirit vein to undergo an extremely mysterious change. This was originally just a node. At this moment, it was like a door that could be entered and exited at will. At this moment, boundless energy poured into the spirit vein from the void. At the same time, an endless amount of energy gushed out from the spiritual vein. These changes formed a perfect cycle, causing the spirit vein to not increase or decrease. Moreover, it caused the vitality in the spirit vein to suddenly rise like a rocket, and it kept increasing. The leaders were shocked when they saw such a method that seemed like it was creating something out of thin air. This heaven and earth was not any other heaven and earth, nor was it some inner heaven and earth. This spirit vein was not the spirit vein in their inner world. This was a spirit vein that was extremely vast, powerful, and stable. To existences at the innate golden immortal realm like them, even if they came into contact with such an existence, they would have to protect themselves firmly. Only then would they be able to avoid being struck by the energy of the spirit vein, and they would be able to maintain their bodies intact and avoid exploding into powder. Under such circumstances, their methods of self-sufficiency and creation naturally couldn't be used on this kind of spiritual vein. This was also the fundamental reason why they couldn't use their methods on this spiritual vein, even though they clearly had the ability to create all things. However, at this moment, the expert before them had changed the appearance of the spirit vein with just a casual slap of his hand, causing this area to turn from an ordinary node of the spirit vein into a holy land of cultivation that would bring countless benefits even to innate Grand Luo realm cultivators like them. How could they not be shocked by such a change? How could they not be horrified? At this moment, they were extremely glad that they had been honest earlier. They even decided in their hearts that they would definitely be more respectful and honest when they encountered something like this again in the future. Clearly, Luo Fan's actions did not just change the spirit vein. Under his will, the terrain below continued to change. Gradually, all kinds of strange materials began to bulge up, and began to gradually build countless buildings. It did not take long for the outline of a huge city to appear here. The outline of the city directly enveloped the entire spirit vein node, or in other words, the range of the spirit vein's gateway, causing the energy that constantly entered and exited the spirit vein to constantly pass through the city and accumulate in the city. It gradually increased the density of the world's essence in the city, causing the essence of the world here to gradually carry all sorts of mysterious information, which was beneficial to the cultivation of all the cultivators who lived here. Of course, although the general outline of the city had been formed, in the end only the outline was fixed. Apart from a large area of extremely solemn and majestic buildings in the northwest corner, the rest of the place was empty. Next, all of you can choose a place to establish a cave abode and live. You don't have to pay any price, you just have to abide by the rules of this city, Luo Fan said indifferently to the leaders. Hearing this, the leaders felt as if they had been hit by a pie that fell from the sky. They had fought so hard. Did they not fight so hard just to occupy the spirit vein node and establish a cave abode here to cultivate? Now, an even more powerful existence had appeared. They had already given up hope, but they did not expect that they could actually live here without paying any price. How could they find such a good thing in this world? At that moment, they hurriedly nodded in agreement. After a while, one of the leaders asked carefully, "May I know what the rules of this city are? Please give us some pointers, Exalted One." Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled. He pointed at Hun Ku and said, "When she has thought it through, she will tell you." Hearing this, before the other leaders could say anything, Hun Ku already cried out in surprise, "What? Me? No, I can't do it. Father, you do it." The air hostess in the alternate timeline smiled and said, "Don't decline. This city was built for you to play with. You can do whatever you want. Even if you want to let all of them fight for you, it's up to you." Hearing this, not only did Hun Ku's expression change, but the other leaders' expressions also changed. At this moment, all of them were powerless and silently cursing. "Even if this is your real intention, you don't have to say it in front of us, right? So what's our reaction going to be, okay?" At this moment, Hun Ku hurriedly shook her head and said, "Why would I set such a rule?" Luo Fan smiled at this time and said, "All right. Think carefully about what rules you want to set next. Next, I'll decorate your cave abode for you." With that said, he took Hun Ku and directly appeared in front of the newly built building. After they left, the expressions on the faces of the few leaders changed. After a while, one of them said to the others, "What's your plan?" Although they had fought extremely fiercely before, now that there was no longer any conflict between them, the previous fight no longer counted for anything. On the contrary, because of the previous battle, they had built up quite a bit of friendship. It was not your friends who knew you best, but your enemies. This saying was not just for show. As for the subordinates and disciples who had died in the previous fight, so what? With such a place that was beneficial to his cultivation, the matter of training disciples to help him seemed to have become secondary. Hearing his words, another leader said, "I plan to settle here. My goal is to settle there." As he spoke, he pointed to the northwest corner of the city, which was the location of the building near Luo Fan and the others. Seeing him pointing there, the other leaders' expressions changed slightly. One of them sneered and said, "Your Excellency, that is a bit too much. That place is the best place in this city. Why should we give it to you?" In terms of geographical environment, natural environment, formation environment, and so on, there was nothing special about the northwest corner. However, if Luo Fan's building was added there, the situation would be completely different. With the existence of Luo Fan and the others, that ordinary and simple place had become a wonderful holy place, a place that they would fight for even at the cost of their lives. His words made the others feel as if they had just woken up from a dream. One by one, they looked at the others warily. Seeing that they were about to fight over that word, a voice was heard. It was the voice that had asked them about all kinds of information that was close to common sense for 10 days and 10 nights. The first rule is that there can be no fighting in this city. As soon as this was said, the expressions on the faces of the few of them stiffened, and they suddenly felt somewhat at a loss. To them, fighting was already their instinct. Under such circumstances, the only way to resolve the dispute was, of course, to fight. Now that their only method had been restricted, they actually did not know how to resolve this dispute. As for withdrawing and letting the others go to that place, that was naturally impossible. At this moment, the first leader who had spoken to occupy the place chuckled and said, "I said that place first, so that place is mine. That place is mine." Of course, these words were opposed by the others in unison. "If you have the guts, make a move," the leader said extremely proudly at this moment. At this moment, he was actually extremely glad that the woman had set such a rule. With this rule, why would he still have to worry about not being able to occupy that place? No. Although we can't fight, we can use other methods to resolve the dispute. Another leader shouted. Every living being was forced to do so. Before this, no matter how they thought about it, they could not think of how to resolve the dispute without fighting. However, at this moment, after the method of fighting was restricted, they quickly thought of a method. "I don't accept it. Anyway, I have already occupied that place, so it is mine." That leader chuckled. As he spoke, he walked forward. He was about to go to that place. At this moment, both of his eyes almost popped out, because he realized that there were already a few figures approaching the place that he was originally looking at. Looking at those figures, who else could it be other than the few leaders beside him? The leader's thoughts turned quickly, and in the blink of an eye, he already understood what was going on. He could not help but curse. "Why don't you guys follow the rules? Clearly, I said it first. You actually sent your clones to occupy the place first. Ha ha. This is not about us not following the rules. Just because you said it is yours, it is yours. If you are unwilling to use other methods to resolve our differences, then it can only belong to whoever occupies it first. If you are dissatisfied, you can make a move. You can attack." The one who spoke was the leader at the front of the doppelgangers. At this moment, the other leaders' expressions were extremely solemn. Although they had all thought of this method to occupy the place first, they were still a step too late. If this continued, when they reached that place would already be occupied by someone else. Once the other party occupied the place, as long as they did not take the initiative to come out, they would not be able to do anything. Making a move was already not allowed. As for other methods to resolve the problem like gambling, the other party was not stupid, so how could they agree to it? Under such circumstances, it would be strange if they had the desire to speak. At that moment, those clones displayed their divine abilities, and their speed soared. They began to frantically chase after the clone at the front, wanting to be one step ahead of the other to reach that place. The pressure of this speed made the clone at the front not dare to be distracted anymore. Similarly, he used his own methods to increase his speed as much as he could. Finally, after consuming a large amount of essence blood, he finally pushed through the crowd and was the first to rush into that place, occupying it. Seeing this scene, the clones could only stop one by one. If they rushed in again, they would start a fight. The leader who had first spoken to occupy the place looked at them from behind, his face full of displeasure. He looked at the creature beside him, who kept thanking him, and had an impulse to tear him to pieces. How interesting! I didn't expect that just a silhouette would be so interesting. How fun! At this moment, in the building in the northwest corner, Hunku grinned at Luo Fan and the air hostess from an alternate timeline. Everything that happened outside was witnessed by the three of them. It was also because of this that Hunku released the first rule at the most crucial moment. If you think it's interesting, then think of more rules. In a city, one rule is obviously not enough. Luo Fan just smiled. The air hostess from an alternate timeline also had a faint smile on her face, which actually looked somewhat gentle. That's right. You've already experienced the fun of making rules. Next, just do as you please. If there are any problems, it doesn't matter. You can just change it. When Hunku heard that, she couldn't help but nod, her face full of interest. While they were talking, outside the building, in the silhouette of the city, there was another round of fighting. Although the best place, which was closest to Luo Fan's cave abode, had already been occupied, the other second-tier places still existed. Since they couldn't fight for the best place, they naturally wouldn't let go of the second-tier places. Swoosh, 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 sharp whistling sounds came continuously from everywhere. Figures quickly rushed to various places, using their own speed to fight for a place. Judging from the number of figures, it was obvious that the leaders had already ordered their subordinates and disciples to take action. As for how they were going to inform them, it was needless to say. After all, they were Khanate Grand Luo realm existences. It was too easy for them to transmit information through invisible means. In such a fight, it was naturally impossible for one side to have an absolute advantage while the other side was completely inferior. Therefore, some good places were naturally obtained by a certain force, while some neighboring places were obtained by other forces. Just like that, after a round of fighting, the originally distinct forces were completely mixed together and could no longer be distinguished. Seeing this, Luo Fan and the air hostess from an alternate timeline did not feel anything. After all, such a situation was too common for them. However, Hunku instantly fell into an inexplicable state. Her eyes flickered with a strange light, and her expression was inexplicably startled. It was as if she had suddenly comprehended something and understood a profound truth that she hadn't thought of before. Chapter 1893. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. At this moment, Hunku's heart was in turmoil. Countless thoughts, and countless mysteries popped up, but when she thought about it carefully, there seemed to be nothing at all. Nothing seemed to exist. This inexplicable state might be extremely irritating for ordinary people, but for Hunku, she felt extremely relaxed and joyful, as if this state was extremely natural to her. During this process, her cultivation realm faintly fluctuated inexplicably. In a trance, it began to rise continuously. Endless power began to be born naturally in her body, gradually filling her body and changing her body. Her body gradually turned into a completely different state from before, forming a completely different mystery. Looking at the changes that happened to Hunku, the air maiden in the alternate timeline finally sighed. With a thought, she casually waved her hand in the void, and the endless rules and principles around her began to shift away from the natural changes. Gradually, some gaps were formed, and a vacuum of rules and principles appeared around Hunku. This allowed Hunku's body to gradually break away from the effects of the rules and principles. Her power began to continuously increase, and she began to gradually transform, constructing all sorts of mysterious, wonderful, but somewhat crude and extremely incomplete rules and principles. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the void gradually condensed, and an indescribable pressure began to spread from the tribulation clouds. It pressed down and gradually pressed down on Hunku's body. Space Maiden, who was in a different timeline, had obviously expected such a change. At this moment, with a thought, she casually waved her hand, dispersing all the pressure. The tribulation clouds in the sky also gradually dispersed at this moment, and not long after, they had already disappeared. And at this moment, Hunku's expression had already recovered, and she had broken away from that inexplicable state. The aura on her body was already completely different from before. If her aura was said to be naive and romantic before, completely natural without any traces of artificial refinement, then, now, she already had an additional profundity that couldn't be naturally possessed. Vaguely, there seemed to be an existence that could support everything in her body. This was a sign that he was about to comprehend his own path of cultivation. Moreover, his cultivation had unknowingly risen to the peak of the innate golden immortal realm, and he was just a step away from breaking through. Stepping into the sage-to-be realm, he was just short of a final bit of enlightenment and a final push. And this bit of understanding, this bit of impact, was her own path of cultivation. Normally speaking, this kind of cultivation path should have been established when one reached the immortal realm. After that, continuous improvement meant continuous expansion and strengthening of this path of cultivation, all the way to the connate grand immortal realm. It could barely be considered complete, barely complete. However, this was not the case for Hunku. Even though Hunku didn't have many memories and was just like a newly born creature, its foundation was still its own foundation. After all, it wasn't the foundation of an ordinary creature, but a powerful existence that was obviously not much weaker than the air hostess from an alternate timeline. Such an existence, the powerful essence it brought was naturally of great use to him. Therefore, it was the starting point. Compared to ordinary creatures, it was much higher. In this way, she didn't have to establish her own path of cultivation at all, and she was able to forcefully push her cultivation to the first heaven golden immortal realm. However, this was clearly only the innate golden immortal realm. There was a fundamental difference between the demi-saint realm and the innate golden immortal realm. Such a fundamental difference meant that any living creature that wanted to break through to the innate golden immortal realm would need a core, a foundation to support himself, and this core, this foundation, was his own path of cultivation. In other words, even an existence like Hunku couldn't break through the innate golden immortal realm and step into the demi-saint realm without first confirming his own path of cultivation and perfecting it to a certain extent. This was also the fundamental reason why Hunku stopped before the demi-saint realm even though she had comprehended something that allowed her to improve rapidly, and this was Hunku's next task. Whether it was the main character of the world or anything else, strength was absolutely necessary. Without sufficient strength, even if one was the main character of the world, it would be an extremely tragic main character of the world. Since Hunku had called Luo Fan daddy a few times, he naturally couldn't bear to see her become some tragic main character of the world. This was also the fundamental reason why he had set up this city. "I think I've found it," Hunku said to Luo Fan and the alternate timeline's emptiness. "It's good that you found it. Next, you need to perfect it and nurture it so that it can undergo a fundamental transformation and grow to a level comparable to the world," Luo Fan said. The alternate timeline's emptiness nodded and said, "That's right. I'll leave this place to you." "What? Daddy, Mommy, are you leaving?" Hunku, who was delighted at first, couldn't help but panic when she heard that. Luo Fan smiled and said, "It's meaningless for us to stay here. Don't worry, we'll keep an eye on you." "No. I don't want to search for the path of cultivation. I want to be by your side," Hunku screamed. Luo Fan and the alternate timeline's emptiness looked at each other and smiled. Then, their figures slowly dissipated and vanished into nothingness in the blink of an eye. Hunku couldn't react to his straightforwardness for a moment. She looked rather dazed. How could this be? She mumbled as tears welled up in her eyes. "Aren't we going a little overboard? She's only been born for a few days, right?" The alternate timeline's emptiness said with pity. They hadn't actually left yet. They were merely hiding in the void. As for why Hunku didn't discover them, it was simple. After all, both of them were existences that far surpassed the Supreme Emperor realm. Compared to Hunku, who was only at the peak of the connate Grand Luo, they were more than 1,000,000,000 times stronger. If they didn't want her to discover them, she wouldn't be able to discover them even if she died. Although she's only been born for a few days, she's completely different from ordinary living beings. She might not be used to what we're doing at the start. But she'll get used to it soon, Luo Fan said. Hunku cried for a while before wiping her tears and saying, "Daddy, Mommy, I know you're looking at me. Don't worry, I'll be strong. I'll definitely nurture this city into the largest and most prosperous city in the world. The most lively and orderly city. When the time comes, I'll definitely be able to use this nurturing process to understand my own path. I'll break through the realm and truly catch up to you." Look, am I right? Am I right? Luo Fan laughed. On her. It's getting more and more peaceful. The alternate timeline's emptiness just sighed. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, she's the continuation of a peaceful life. This is normal. The alternate timeline's emptiness sighed and didn't say anything else. Seeing that she wasn't interested in talking, Luo Fan couldn't be bothered with her. With a thought, the power within his body surged, and the laws and principles around him rippled subtly. With a slight tremble, a world was formed out of thin air, embedded within the laws and laws. It was like a part of the rules and laws. After constructing this world, he took a step forward without any hesitation, and his figure had already stepped into that world. The composition of this world was what Luo Fan was most familiar with. It was the composition of the universe. Standing here, he naturally felt incomparably small. The feeling of the boundless universe naturally emerged. And this kind of mentality was the same as being the creator of this world. He was inexplicably conflicted with the feeling that he was incomparably powerful and omnipotent here. In the midst of this conflict, it formed an indescribable state of mind, which was quite beneficial for cultivation. After Luo Fan entered the world that was created out of thin air, the alternate timeline's emptiness returned to her senses and sighed. With a thought, countless obscure runes gushed out of her body. They spun in the air, condensed, and turned into a rune ring. This ring was fundamentally different from the rune ring from before. After it was formed, with a slight tremble, a mysterious world that was constantly evolving and changing had already been constructed in the center of it. The state of this world was completely different from the world that Luo Fan had constructed. One was extremely stable, while the other was constantly changing, almost reaching the pinnacle of change. The two were almost polar opposite. As the ever-changing world was formed, the alternate timeline's emptiness sighed and stepped into that world. The rune ring also began to slowly shrink, gradually turning invisible and disappearing within the laws and principles. It could no longer be found. The two of them had used their own methods to directly construct a cave abode for themselves. At this moment, Luo Fan was in the cave abode that he had constructed. With a wave of his hand, a mirror-like spiritual treasure embryo appeared in his hand. This spiritual treasure embryo was extremely mysterious and wonderful. It faintly emitted an indescribable, eternal, and indestructible aura. As his mind immersed itself in the spiritual treasure embryo, Luo Fan seemed to have turned into an extremely mysterious embryo in a trance. It seemed to be constantly attracting an indescribable existence to nurture and strengthen itself. An indescribable comfort and joy appeared in his heart at this moment. It made him feel as if his entire body, both inside and outside, was undergoing some kind of crucial cleansing. In this process, the various blurry essences of cultivation became clearer and clearer. Then, an indescribable desire emerged in his heart. This desire was directed towards nothing else but something on his body. Although he felt as if he was about to turn into an embryo in this state, Luo Fan was Luo Fan, after all. Although this state was mysterious, it was still not enough to completely suppress his rationality. Therefore, during this process, he could still clearly sense what he desired in his heart, and he could also clearly sense it. He could also clearly sense where the source of this desire was. Chaos gems. In the blink of an eye, he had already locked onto the treasure that he had obtained a lot of time but had yet to use. With a single thought, the tens of thousands of chaos gems that he had previously put away floated out one by one. The aura of chaos began to slowly release, gradually filling the world that he had constructed with this indescribable aura of chaos. This caused the world to gradually undergo an indescribable change, as if it was enveloped in a layer of gray mist. At this moment, the instinctive desire transmitted from the spiritual treasure embryo suddenly intensified by several times. Even the spiritual treasure embryo began to tremble slightly at this moment. It seemed as if it could no longer suppress its instinctive desire. It wanted to pounce on those chaos gems and turn them into its own. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer suppressed the chaos gems. With a single thought, he lifted his hand and the chaos gems rushed towards the spiritual treasure embryo one after another. Finally, due to a mysterious power, the spiritual treasure embryo shrank. It was as if specks of light were entering the mirror. Bang, 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 bang. Crisp sounds of explosions continuously rang out from the mirror of the spiritual treasure embryo. At this moment, the spiritual treasure embryo began to squirm inexplicably. It was as if it was undergoing some kind of undetectable growth. A feeling that was several times more comfortable than before enveloped Luo Fan. At the same time, there was an indescribable sense of satisfaction that accompanied this comfort. This feeling made him understand that these chaos gems would be extremely beneficial to the growth of the spiritual treasure embryo. Under the urging of this feeling, without any hesitation, Luo Fan sent more and more chaos gems into the spiritual treasure embryo, causing it to squirm continuously. Although tens of thousands of chaos gems were not a small number, however, it wasn't limitless. Unknowingly, all the chaos gems had been sent in. At this moment, an indescribable sense of emptiness and dissatisfaction emerged in his heart. This emptiness and dissatisfaction made Luo Fan suddenly feel an indescribable sense of irritation. Fortunately, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan after all. He wouldn't completely lose his composure because of this. At this moment, he finally came back to his senses and suppressed this irritation. After a while, the changes in the spiritual treasure embryo calmed down and the entire spiritual treasure embryo returned to its initial calm state. The indescribable desire had also disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed the spiritual treasure embryo once again and experienced the difference between it and the previous spiritual treasure embryo. This experience made him feel a little helpless. Tens of thousands of chaos gems had been thrown into the spiritual treasure embryo, but it had only grown a tiny bit. Even this tiny bit had been sensed by Luo Fan relying on his unimaginably sharp senses and meticulous senses. So many chaos gems were needed for this tiny bit of growth. Just how many chaos gems would be needed for this spiritual treasure to truly take shape? A feeling of a long road ahead suddenly emerged in his heart. After a while, he could only smile bitterly to himself. Wasn't this inevitable? Wanting to cultivate a primordial origin spiritual treasure embryo into a true primordial origin spiritual treasure was as difficult as growing a being at his level to the true sage realm. Being able to use chaos stones to increase its strength a little was already an extremely unexpected benefit. How could he even dream of increasing the speed and magnitude of the increase? As he sighed to himself, a thought flashed across his mind. Why can chaos gems help the spiritual treasure embryo grow? As this thought went deeper, he suddenly understood where the best place to cultivate this spiritual treasure embryo was. The aura of chaos. The greatest benefit of chaos gems to this spiritual treasure embryo must be the aura of chaos. If that's the case, that place is clearly the best place to cultivate this spiritual treasure embryo. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he did not hesitate to put the spiritual treasure embryo into his body. Immediately after, he took a step forward and his figure had already crossed this part of the world. He appeared in the building that he had specially built for the primordial origin spiritual treasure. After arriving here, he did not care about anything else. He carefully sensed his surroundings and began to gradually dig in. The rules and laws gradually dissipated in his senses. His senses gradually penetrated into the depths of the rules and laws, and gradually penetrated into the depths of this part of the world. An increasingly strong resistance was acting on his perception, pushing and obstructing him. Every step he took forward required him to expend a great deal of energy. Just like that, 3 years passed before he finally managed to penetrate his perception to the depth that he wanted. He had made contact with the barrier that he wanted to make contact with. It was the barrier between heaven and earth and the state of primordial chaos. There was a barrier between heaven and earth and the state of primordial chaos. This barrier had different existences in the eyes of living beings with different worldviews. For other living beings, this barrier was nothing more than a barrier. However, to Luo Fan, there was an extremely mysterious layer within this barrier. It was a wonderful place formed by the state of primordial chaos and the state of primordial chaos. That was the gap between heaven and earth and the state of primordial chaos. And the reason why Luo Fan thought of that gap was because there was an endless amount of primal chaos aura in that gap. To be continued. Chapter 1896. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. The endless power in Luo Fan's body constantly seeped into the vortex of laws above his palm, suppressing the vortex of laws from merging with the void and merging with the endless laws. This kind of connection between the laws was an extremely mysterious power. It could even be considered an extremely terrifying power. It wasn't an easy task, even for Luo Fan, to suppress this force and completely eliminate it. In terms of absolute power, he could easily suppress the laws, but the traction clearly wasn't just a matter of pure power. Every rule and law was constantly jumping and trembling during this process, constantly searching for a loophole in the power of Luo Fan's hand. They even created their own loopholes and used the overall power of the world to form an inexplicable impact, creating a crushing effect to attack his power, wanting to break away from the control of his power. This made Luo Fan not only have to guard against the laws, but he also had to guard against the world. It went without saying that the difficulty of this task was huge. Even Luo Fan had no choice but to concentrate and do his best to suppress the laws. He did his best to push them into the abyss of destruction so that they wouldn't truly merge with the world. However, his efforts were fruitful after all. As he bound the laws in his palm, the creatures with 3 heads and 6 arms that had pounced on Hun Ku's city, which had reached tens of millions, finally stopped replicating. However, the number was already under control. The fact that the number had stopped growing had clearly given the many living beings in the city a huge boost of confidence. They finally had a glimmer of hope amidst their despair. Stimulated by this glimmer of hope, they naturally carried out Hun Ku's orders even more thoroughly. In an instant, streaks of light appeared one after another. Streaks of light, sound waves, and indescribable colors continuously erupted from the city, charging into the midst of the creatures with 3 heads and 6 arms, engaging them in a fierce battle. Of course, compared to the creatures with 3 heads and 6 arms, the creatures that had rushed out of the city were much more disciplined. Moreover, they were secretly supporting each other. As the power flowed, it created an effect that was greater than 2. This caused their power to continuously rise as the cycle of reincarnation changed. Their teamwork was so tight that even the existences among them who were far weaker than the 3-headed, 6-armed creature were able to hold on. They were able to fight back and forth against those living beings, and they did not suffer too many casualties. Of course, it was just not too disastrous. Many creatures died in that battle. Even more living beings were able to grow within it. Many living beings even broke through their cultivation realms and stepped into the quasi-sage realm. In the battle of iron and blood, the stimulation to the souls of the living beings participating in the battle was not something that could be compared to during peacetime. For those who only lacked a little bit of spiritual enlightenment, it was not impossible for them to achieve a breakthrough in battle. During this process, Hun Ku's eyes were solemn. Her mind had been pushed to its limits, and her power had been pushed to an indescribable level. Not only did she command the many residents in the city to cooperate with each other in the battle, she also participated in the battle herself. One after another, the 3-headed, 6-armed creatures were chopped into pieces. Although her Tao attainment realm was limited to the innate Grand Luo realm, and she had never broken through, she had stepped into the quasi-sage realm. Although Hun Ku had stepped into the sage-to-be realm, her talent was still there. Moreover, she had been intentionally or unintentionally advised by Luo Fan and the air hostess from a different timeline. Therefore, Hun Ku's own strength could not be described by this cultivation realm. In fact, the strength she could display was something that even a quasi-sage could not compare to. Only a false sage could truly suppress her. If that was not the case, how could there be ordinary residents of the quasi-sage realm in the city? No matter what world it was, strength was a passport. Without sufficient strength, one could only become a puppet at most, no matter how high one's status was. If Hun Ku did not have the strength to suppress those quasi-sage realm existences, she could only become a nominal leader in the city. To Hun Ku, this battle was the most tragic one she had ever encountered in her life. Moreover, the chaos that was rapidly occurring in various parts of the world brought an indescribable pressure to her heart. It made her wonder if the world was already riddled with holes, and the fate of destruction was unavoidable. Under the pressure of reality and mental pressure, Hun Ku was unable to maintain her calm state of mind. At this moment, her thoughts fluctuated in a split second, and the birth and death of her thoughts couldn't be compared to what she had experienced in the past few months. Under such circumstances, the power in her body was already boiling, and all sorts of indescribable spiritual light surged around her. As she waved her hands, the laws of heaven and earth naturally responded to her, erupting earth-shattering might. The three-headed, six-armed creature that seemed to be at the same level as her was easily annihilated like a dog being slaughtered. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere, while mournful howls gradually lingered around her and drilled into her ears at all times. It was as if there was a wave of resentment that lingered around Hun Ku every time one of those creatures died. In less than half a day, the resentment on Hun Ku's body had already become so dense that it had completely solidified, turning into a pitch-black aura that enveloped her body. Anyone could hear the miserable cries of ghosts and howls of gods from within. If such resentment appeared on an ordinary person, it would be enough to make that person's mind break down immediately and die a violent death. However, at this moment, the resentment that wrapped around Hun Ku's body did not have any effect at all. In the process of continuously rushing into Hun Ku's body, it was as if a layer of incomparably tight defense had crashed into it, and all the impact and power had been directly dissipated. This was because the tempering of Hun Ku's mind over the years had already reached a certain profound level. The reason why it was difficult for the resentment to have any effect was because Hun Ku had an invisible mysterious fate protecting her, allowing her to be as little affected by the resentment as possible. Although there were many more residents in the city, their overall strength was still lacking. Therefore, in the end, it was impossible to stop all the creatures outside the city. During the battle, there were hundreds of thousands of three-headed and six-armed creatures that broke through their defensive layer and crashed into the city, intending to start a massacre. However, after they crashed into the wall, they realized that dozens of strange rules suddenly took effect on them, restricting their means of fighting together, causing them to be unable to display even half of their strength. It even gradually changed their way of thinking. It made them feel that apart from being unable to fight in the city, they had to start acting according to all kinds of rules and regulations. This unprecedented situation since they were born made them all at a loss. They did not start attacking in the city, but stood there quietly and did not dare to move. It looked as if there were suddenly hundreds of thousands of statues in the city, and their arrival seemed to have triggered some kind of inexplicable change. The city gradually began to tremble under this change. There was a faint, inexplicable light that began to radiate from every inch of land, every building, and even every inch of the void in the city. Countless strands of silk kept appearing during this process. In the end, it gradually formed an indescribable, wondrous state. It combined into an unimaginably huge network, wrapping the entire city and all the living beings within it. In the end, endless light gathered. In that network, there were 72 threads that were originally much weaker than the other thread. They seemed to have turned into black holes. They began to frantically swallow the light. As they swallowed, the 72 threads began to expand rapidly. In a short while, they were no longer the size of the other threads. They continued to strengthen and expand without stopping. In just a short span of a few breaths, it had already expanded into 72 strange beams of light. They were like 72 strangely shaped pillars that appeared in the network. With the appearance of these 72 pillars, the originally extremely balanced network instantly gained a backbone. All of the network began to gradually connect with these 72 pillars, gradually putting pressure on these 72 pillars. In other words, it became the support of these 72 pillars. Along with this change, rumbling sounds came from the void. Vaguely, an inexplicable joy was gradually revealed. At this moment, all of the network in the city slowly disappeared. In the end, only the 72 pillars of light vaguely formed a sparse network that seemed crude at first glance, but was actually boundlessly mysterious. In a short while, even the network formed by the 72 pillars disappeared. After all of the pillars of light disappeared, the bodies of the hundreds of thousands of three-headed and six-armed creatures in the city trembled. Their ability to move finally completely disappeared, and they became creatures that could not move at all. They were completely restricted by the rules that Hun Ku had set in the city. At this moment, as the owner of the city, Hun Ku immediately sensed something. "What's going on?" She was secretly shocked. She could not figure out the reason for all of this. However, although she could not figure out the reason, Hun Ku was still the owner of the city after all. She also knew what kind of change this represented in the battle situation. Without any hesitation, she ordered everyone to retreat into the city and lure all the three-headed and six-armed creatures into the city. There was no reason for this order, but because her command had already been acknowledged by many other living beings, even though they were confused, they still obeyed her order in the end. All of them retreated into the city. The moment they retreated into the city, an inexplicable feeling appeared in their hearts. This made them instantly understand that all of their strength in the city could no longer be separated from their bodies. They could not even make their bodies react too supernaturally. Although they did not know the reason for this, they already understood why Hun Ku would give such an order. At that moment, they all had looks of anticipation and joy on their faces. The three-headed and six-armed creatures were clearly not very intelligent. To them, the fact that the enemies retreated meant that they were afraid of them. Those creatures with 3 heads and 6 arms clearly didn't have much intelligence. To them, the fact that their enemies retreated meant that they were afraid of them. For a city that could accommodate hundreds of millions of creatures, tens of millions of creatures were really nothing. Tens of millions of living beings were nothing to a city that could accommodate hundreds of millions of living beings. They completely rushed into the city, but it only made the city seem a little more lively. However, there was nothing that could not be accommodated. The moment these creatures stepped into the city, although they still had power and did not turn into mortals, they could no longer fight or exert any power for the purpose of fighting. All of a sudden, all of the living beings were at a loss, just like the hundreds of thousands of 3-headed and 6-armed beings from before. They were at a loss and didn't know how to react. Not long after, the surroundings of the city fell into silence. The originally incomparably tragic battle had already completely calmed down, and was no longer as tragic as before. Compared to the miserable battle, it was like two extremes, making the residents feel as if they had been separated from the world for a while. We won," one of the residents said. Following these words, everyone seemed to have woken up from a dream. For a moment, they burst into cheers and continuously praised Hun Ku's effective command and wise decision. The 72 Tao laws have finally truly fused with the laws of this city. It might even become the foundation of the cauldron. After such a long period of comprehension, Hun-Ku had truly confirmed what she had sensed before. She couldn't help but wear an inexplicable smile on her face. Amidst this smile, her mind suddenly entered an indescribable state. It was as if she had suddenly arrived in an extremely mysterious world. Boundless rays of light and boundless lines filled the entire world around him. Amidst this boundless light and endless lines, there was a kind of light and a kind of line that produced a boundless attractive force, attracting her to walk over and grab them in her hands. These are the paths. At this moment, Hun-Ku instinctively understood where they were. She knew what the boundless light around them was, and she understood what the endless lines were. Those lines were none other than what she understood, the endless path of cultivation, and those lights were the corresponding power of all the cultivation paths. When she understood this, the meaning of the endless lines around her and the mystery of the endless lights surfaced in her heart without reservation. This allowed her to clearly understand what these lines and these lights clearly represented. She knew what her current choice of line represented. Creating the rules. She murmured and said the path that the line that had an endless attractive force represented. At this moment, all her previous experiences and comprehensions resurfaced in her heart again, allowing her to feel her own soul, her own self-awareness, and her own will with unprecedented clarity. In her heart, everything seemed to be pointing towards the morality that she sensed at this moment, the cultivation path that was the most attractive to her. However, for some reason, Hun-Ku felt that something was wrong. That cultivation path seemed to be inexplicably awkward. Creating the rule seems to be my cultivation path, but she frowned and didn't make a choice for a long time. She just quietly looked at the endless light and endless lines around her. Every bit of her experience, every bit of her thinking, and every bit of her understanding from the moment she was born to now was constantly circulating in her heart, presenting, "No! This isn't my cultivation path. It's the world that needs my cultivation path." After a long time, a light emerged from the bottom of her heart, causing her to suddenly feel her vision become bright. The endless light around her seemed to gradually dim, and the endless lines also gradually became illusory. As for the endless attractive force that constantly urged her to hold on to it, the line that created the rules and the corresponding light also gradually faded and dimmed. That inexplicable attraction also gradually faded. Of course, it only faded. In the end, the attraction still existed and did not completely disappear. Hun-Ku was very clear about this. She knew that although this cultivation path was the cultivation path that the world needed her to choose, it was still quite similar to her true cultivation path. Naturally, it was more attractive to her than other cultivation paths. What exactly is my cultivation path? The moment this thought appeared in her mind, an indescribable summoning appeared out of nowhere in the depths of the endless threads and the endless light. It faintly tugged at her mind and body as she gradually moved towards the depth. She took one step at a time. Although she was not fast, she was incredibly stable. It was as if every step she took was rooted to the ground, and every step she took seemed to absorb endless power from the place where her feet landed. In a daze, Hun-Ku arrived in front of a seemingly dim but unfathomable, all-encompassing, and endless lines. To be continued. Chapter 1897. The boundless power in Luo Fan's body constantly seeped into the vortex of laws above his palm, suppressing its tendency to merge with the void and turn into the endless laws. This kind of connection between the laws was an extremely mysterious power. It could even be considered an extremely terrifying power. Suppressing this power and completely eliminating its tendency wasn't an easy task, even for Luo Fan. In terms of absolute power, he could easily suppress this nomological law. However, this kind of pulling force was clearly not just a matter of pure power. Every law was constantly jumping and trembling, constantly searching for a loophole in the power in Luo Fan's hand. Some even created their own loopholes and used the overall power of the world to form an indescribable impact, creating a crushing effect to attack his power in an attempt to break free from his power's control. This caused Luo Fan to not only have to guard against these rules and laws, but he also had to guard against this part of the world. The difficulty of this was self-evident. Even Luo Fan had to focus all his attention and do his best to suppress the laws. He did his best to push them into the abyss of destruction so that they wouldn't truly merge with the world. However, his efforts were fruitful after all. As he bound the laws in his palm, the tens of millions of three-headed, six-armed creatures that had pounced on Hun Ku's city finally stopped replicating. However, the number was already under control. The fact that the number had stopped growing had clearly given the many living beings in the city a huge boost of confidence. They finally had a glimmer of hope amidst their despair. Stimulated by this glimmer of hope, they naturally carried out Hun Ku's orders even more thoroughly. In an instant, streaks of light appeared one after another. Streaks of light, sound waves, and indescribable colors continuously erupted from the city, charging towards the many three-headed, six-armed creatures and engaging them in a fierce battle. Of course, compared to the many three-headed, six-armed creatures, the creatures that had rushed out of the city were much more disciplined. Moreover, they seemed to be supporting each other. As the power flowed, it created an effect that was greater than two. This caused their power to continuously rise as the cycle of reincarnation changed. Their teamwork was so tight that even the existences among them who were far weaker than the three-headed, six-armed creature were able to hold on. They were able to fight back and forth against those living beings, and they did not suffer too many casualties. Of course, it was just not too disastrous. Many creatures died in that battle. Even more living beings were able to grow within it. Many living beings even broke through their cultivation realms and stepped into the quasi-sage realm. In the battle of iron and blood, the stimulation to the souls of the living beings participating in the battle was not something that could be compared to during peacetime. For those who only lacked a little bit of spiritual enlightenment, it was not impossible for them to achieve a breakthrough in battle. During this process, Hun Ku's gaze was grave. Her mind had been pushed to the limits, and her power had been pushed to an indescribable level. Not only did he command the many residents in the city to cooperate with each other in battle, but he also participated in the slaughter. One after another, the three-headed, six-armed creatures were chopped into pieces. Although her Tao attainment realm was limited to the innate Grand Luo realm, and she had never broken through, she had stepped into the quasi-sage realm. Although Hun Ku had stepped into the sage-to-be realm, her talent was still there. Moreover, she had been intentionally or unintentionally advised by Luo Fan and the air hostess from a different timeline. Therefore, Hun Ku's own strength could not be described by this cultivation realm. In fact, the strength that she could display was something that even a quasi-sage could not compare to. Perhaps only a false sage could truly suppress her. If that was not the case, how could there be ordinary residents of the quasi-sage realm in that city? No matter what world it was, strength was a passport. Without sufficient strength, one could only become a puppet at most, no matter how high one's status was. If Hun Ku did not have the strength to suppress those quasi-sage realm existences, she could only become a nominal leader in that city. To Hun Ku, this battle was the most tragic one she had ever encountered in her life. Moreover, the chaos that was rapidly occurring in various parts of the world brought an indescribable pressure to her heart. It made her wonder if the world was already riddled with holes, and the fate of destruction was unavoidable. Under the pressure of reality and mental pressure, Hun Ku was unable to maintain her calm state of mind. At this moment, her thoughts fluctuated in a split second, and the birth and death of her thoughts couldn't be compared to what she had experienced in the past few months. Under such circumstances, the power in her body was already boiling. All sorts of indescribable spiritual light surged around her. As she waved her hands, the laws of heaven and earth naturally responded to her, erupting with earth-shattering might. The three-headed, six-armed creatures that seemed to be at the same level as her were easily slaughtered like dogs. Blood and flesh splattered in all directions. Mournful howls gradually lingered around her and drilled into her ears at all times. It was as if a stream of resentment would linger around Hun-Ku every time one of those creatures died. In less than half a day, the resentment on Hun-Ku's body had already become so dense that it had completely solidified, turning into a pitch-black aura that enveloped her body. Anyone could hear the miserable cries of ghosts and howls of gods from within. If this kind of resentment appeared on a normal person, it would be enough to cause that person's mind to collapse immediately and die a violent death. However, at this moment, the resentment that lingered around Hun-Ku's body did not have any effect at all. As it constantly rushed into Hun-Ku's body, it was as if it had rushed up against an extremely tight layer of defense that directly diverted all the impact and power. This was because Hun-Ku's tempering of her mind had reached a certain profound level. The resentment could not have any effect because there was an invisible mysterious fate on Hun-Ku's body that was protecting her, allowing her to be as little affected by the resentment as possible. Although the number of residents in the city was much greater, their overall strength was still lacking. Therefore, in the end, it was impossible to stop all the creatures outside the city. In the battle, there were hundreds of thousands of three-headed and six-armed creatures that broke through their protective layer and directly crashed into the city, wanting to start a massacre. However, after they crashed into the wall, they realized that dozens of strange laws suddenly acted on them, restricting their methods of fighting together, causing them to be unable to display even half of their full strength. Moreover, it was even gradually changing their thinking. It made them feel that apart from being unable to fight in the city, they had to start acting according to all kinds of rules and regulations. This unprecedented situation since they were born made them all at a loss. They did not start attacking in the city, but stood there quietly and did not dare to move. It looked like there were suddenly hundreds of thousands of statues in the city, and their arrival seemed to have triggered some kind of inexplicable change. The city gradually began to tremble under this change. There was a faint, inexplicable light that began to emit from every inch of land, every building, and even every inch of the void in the city. Countless strands of silk kept appearing during this process. In the end, it gradually formed an indescribable, wondrous state. It combined into an unimaginably huge network, wrapping the entire city and all the living beings within it. In the end, endless light gathered. In the network, there were 72 threads that were originally much weaker than the other threads. They seemed to have turned into black holes. They began to crazily swallow the light. As they swallowed, the 72 threads began to rapidly expand. In just a short while, they had already expanded to the size of the other threads. They continued to strengthen and expand without stopping. In just a short span of a few breaths, it had already expanded into 72 strange beams of light. They were like 72 strangely shaped pillars that appeared in the network. With the appearance of these 72 pillars, the originally extremely balanced network instantly gained a backbone. All the network began to gradually connect with these 72 pillars, gradually putting pressure on them. In other words, it became the support of these 72 pillars. Along with this change, a rumbling sound came from the void. Vaguely, there was an inexplicable joy that gradually seeped out. At this moment, all the network in the city slowly disappeared. In the end, only the 72 pillars of light vaguely formed a sparse network that seemed crude at first glance, but was actually boundlessly mysterious. Not long after, even the network formed by the 72 pillars disappeared. After all the pillars of light disappeared, the bodies of the hundreds of thousands of three-headed and six-armed creatures in the city trembled. Their ability to move finally disappeared, and they became creatures that could not move at all. They were completely restricted by the rules that Hun-Ku had set in the city. At this moment, as the owner of the city, Hun-Ku immediately sensed something. What's going on? She was secretly shocked. She could not figure out the reason for all of this. However, although she could not figure out the reason, Hun-Ku was still the owner of the city after all. She also knew that this kind of change meant that the situation of the battle had changed. Without any hesitation, she ordered everyone to retreat into the city and lead all the three-headed and six-armed creatures into the city. This kind of order did not have any reason, but because her command had been acknowledged by many other creatures, they still obeyed her order in the end, even though they were puzzled. They all retreated into the city. The moment they retreated into the city, an inexplicable feeling appeared in their hearts. This made them instantly understand that all of their strength in the city could no longer be separated from their bodies. They could not even push their bodies to make superhuman reactions. Although they did not know the reason for this, they already understood why Hun-Ku would give such an order. At that moment, they all had looks of anticipation and joy on their faces. The three-headed and six-armed creatures were clearly not very intelligent. To them, the fact that the enemies retreated meant that they were afraid of them. Those creatures with 3 heads and 6 arms clearly didn't have much intelligence. To them, the fact that their enemies retreated meant that they were afraid of them. For a city that could accommodate hundreds of millions of creatures, tens of millions of creatures were really nothing. Tens of millions of living beings were nothing to a city that could accommodate hundreds of millions of living beings. They completely rushed into the city, but it only made the city seem a little more lively. However, there was nothing that could not be accommodated. The moment these creatures stepped into the city, although they still had power and did not turn into mortals, they could no longer fight or exert any power for the purpose of fighting. All of a sudden, all of the living beings were at a loss, just like the hundreds of thousands of 3-headed and 6-armed beings from before. They were at a loss and didn't know how to react. Not long after, the surroundings of the city fell into silence. The originally incomparably tragic battle had already completely calmed down, and was no longer as tragic as before. Compared to the miserable battle, it was like two extremes, making the residents feel as if they had been separated from the world for a while. We won," one of the residents said. Following these words, everyone seemed to have woken up from a dream. For a moment, they burst into cheers and continuously praised Hun-Ku's effective command and wise decision. The 72 Tao laws have finally truly fused with the laws of this city. It might even become the foundation of the cauldron. After such a long period of comprehension, Hun-Ku had truly confirmed what she had sensed before. She couldn't help but wear an inexplicable smile on her face. Amidst this smile, her mind suddenly entered an indescribable state. It was as if she had suddenly arrived in an extremely mysterious world. Boundless rays of light and boundless lines filled the entire world around him. Amidst this boundless light and endless lines, there was a kind of light and a kind of line that produced a boundless attractive force, attracting her to walk over and grab them in her hands. These are the paths. At this moment, Hun-Ku instinctively understood where they were. She knew what the boundless light around them was, and she understood what the endless lines were. Those lines were none other than what she understood, the endless path of cultivation, and those lights were the corresponding power of all the cultivation paths. When she understood this, the meaning of the endless lines around her and the mystery of the endless lights surfaced in her heart without reservation. This allowed her to clearly understand what these lines and these lights clearly represented. She knew what her current choice of line represented. Creating the rules. She murmured and said the path that the line that had an endless attractive force represented. At this moment, all her previous experiences and comprehensions resurfaced in her heart, allowing her to feel her own soul, her own self-awareness, and her own will with unprecedented clarity. In her heart, everything seemed to point towards the morality that she sensed at this moment, the cultivation path that was the most attractive to her. However, for some reason, Hun-Ku felt that something was wrong. That cultivation path seemed to be inexplicably awkward. Creating the rules seems to be my cultivation path, but she frowned and didn't make a choice for a long time. She just quietly looked at the endless light and endless lines around her. Every bit of her experience, every bit of her thinking, and every bit of her understanding from the moment she was born kept circling in her heart, presenting, "No! This isn't my cultivation path. It's the world that needs my cultivation path." After a long time, a light emerged from the bottom of her heart, causing her to suddenly feel her vision become bright. The endless light around her seemed to gradually dim, and the endless lines also gradually became illusory. As for the endless attractive force that constantly urged her to hold on to it, the line that created the rules and the corresponding light also gradually faded and dimmed. That inexplicable attraction also gradually diminished. Of course, it only diminished. In the end, the attraction still existed and did not completely disappear. Hunku was very clear about this. She knew that although this cultivation path was the cultivation path that the world needed her to choose, it was still quite similar to her true cultivation path. Naturally, it was more attractive to her than other cultivation paths. What exactly is my cultivation path? The moment this thought appeared in her mind, an indescribable summoning appeared out of nowhere in the depths of the endless threads and the endless light. It faintly tugged at her mind and body as she gradually moved towards the depth. She took one step at a time. Although she was not fast, she was incredibly stable. It was as if every step she took was rooted to the ground, and every step she took seemed to absorb endless power from the place where her feet landed. Chapter 1899. This kind of change was subtle and unpredictable. Even though Hunku was the ruler of this city and could understand all the changes in this city, he couldn't clearly know the final result of this change. He could only wait for this change to end and for this change to take effect. Countless seven-colored rays of light continuously seeped into the crystal, stirring up the smoke in the countless worlds, causing the smoke to gradually dissipate amidst the endless changes. She wanted to read a book. Finally, at a certain moment, a ray of light that was many times more intense than before was emitted from the crystal. As this ray of light spread, the crystal gradually melted and sublimated. In the end, it completely disappeared, as if it had completely integrated into this city. At this moment, an indescribable enlightenment appeared in Hunku's heart. So, this is what this change is. She murmured with excitement and an inexplicable sense of panic. She was excited because she had grasped such a terrifying power. On the other hand, she was panicking because this power was so terrifying that it terrified her. It was so terrifying that she even felt that she would be targeted by all living beings in this world and would face endless tribulations. The function that the Space Maiden from a different timeline had obtained was transformation. After the countless insects integrated into this city, the nomological laws of this city had an unimaginable assimilation effect. As long as certain conditions were met, Hunku could completely transform any location in this world into a place with the same nomological laws as this city. In other words, she could turn it into a place that was completely under her control. This power was so terrifying that if Hunku wanted to, she could even completely devour this entire world, and make herself the true ruler of this world. How could she not be excited? How could she not panic? Just then, thunderous booms rang out from the void above. It was as if this world was constantly berating something. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He naturally knew that although these sounds weren't the world's will speaking, they were an instinctive echo of the world. In other words, just like how there were countless sounds in the bodies of ordinary living beings that were not under their control, these were some kind of sound that naturally came from the world's will. This kind of sound didn't have any real meaning. At least, it wasn't within the scope of living beings' understanding. The true meaning. In other words, it was impossible to obtain any words or will from it. However, the appearance of such a voice represented a fact, and that was that this change was not even under the control of the will of the heavens and earth. If he couldn't appease it, he wouldn't be able to satisfy it. Then, the reaction of the world would definitely be even more terrifying than the reaction of the will of the world back then. This was just like how an ordinary creature's body strangled a substance that was harmful to it. The world is waiting for you. Looking at the panicking Hun Ku, Luo Fan sighed and said indifferently. Upon hearing this, before Hun Ku could react, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline had a change of expression. Now that he understood what this meant, there was a hint of regret in his eyes. Hun Ku blankly looked at Luo Fan, then blankly looked at the city, and then blankly looked at the sky. It was as if he could see the source of the countless explosions in the sky. All kinds of thoughts and inspirations kept appearing in her mind. The rumbling sounds in the sky became even stronger, more shocking and more terrifying. After a while, Hun Ku suddenly had a flash of inspiration. She combined the various sensations that the sound transmitted to her and Luo Fan's words. Coupled with the change in the expression of the empty maiden in the alternate timeline, she completely understood what she had to do. She sighed and walked up step by step. The void beneath her feet seemed to have materialized, supporting her in an incomparably stable manner, causing her steps to become more and more solid. Following this change, an indescribable aura was emitted from her body. This aura covered everything and gradually shrouded the entire city, causing the structure of the city to change slightly. All the living beings in the city felt an indescribable impact from the void. It impacted their souls and made them feel that something big was about to happen. It seems like she has finally made up her mind. Luo Fan sighed. Perhaps I shouldn't have done that before. Otherwise, she would still have had a chance to choose, but now she no longer has a choice. The empty maiden in the alternate timeline also sighed. However, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "It doesn't matter if you do it or not. If the world wants her to do this, there will always be a way to succeed. No matter how much you delay it, it will only become more troublesome in the end." When she heard this, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable expression. The expression was so strange that Luo Fan could not make sense of it. "Are you comforting me?" the empty maiden in the alternate timeline suddenly asked. When he heard this, Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. This doesn't seem to be the time to say this. At this moment, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline smiled sweetly. Suddenly, a look of pride that Luo Fan was very familiar with appeared on her face. She said, "You must have unknowingly transferred your feelings for your cultivation partner to me." When Luo Fan heard this, he was slightly stunned. Then, he frowned and fell into deep thought. After a while, he said, "Although I don't want to admit it, perhaps a little." When she heard Luo Fan admit it directly, the empty maiden in the alternate timeline could not react in time. For a moment there was silence. At this moment, there was another change on Hun Ku's side in the void. At this moment, she had already reached a height of tens of thousands of miles above the ground. Looking down from above, the entire city was completely covered by her body. At this moment, an invisible altar appeared out of thin air under her feet. This altar was similar to the one that had summoned Luo Fan. However, the degree of its mysteriousness had increased by several points, and its surface was flickering with flowing lights. Countless mysterious patterns gradually lit up during this process, faintly producing buzzing vibrations. Hun Ku stood on this altar and bowed towards the sky. In an instant, the rumbling sound in the sky stopped. There was silence between the heavens and the earth, as if no sound had ever been heard. It was more like the entire world was waiting for Hun Ku to speak and for her decision. Hun Ku immediately spat out a long string of obscure and profound words. These words and sentences were neat and elegant, and if they were taken out, the crowd would be shocked. If they were taken outside, they would definitely be famous pieces that would be passed down through the ages. They could become a model for poetry. Her voice did not use any power, nor did it trigger any rules. It was just the most ordinary voice. However, this voice passed through the altar and spread far into the world. All the living beings in the world could hear this voice clearly. This kind of obscurity, these profound and beautiful words naturally contained an indescribably solemn atmosphere. All living beings who heard these words naturally listened attentively to them with solemn expressions. I am willing to be the celestial emperor, overlooking the mountains and rivers. In the end, when those words were spoken, a rumbling sound filled the sky and earth. There was an indescribable joy and gratification in that voice. Every living thing and existence in this world could clearly sense that the world was feeling joy because of these words. Other words, those living beings might not have been able to hear it clearly, but this last sentence was spoken in the simplest language, so how could any living being not have heard it clearly? For a moment, all kinds of inexplicable shock, inexplicable panic, inexplicable anger. They emerged from the hearts of all living beings. Becoming a celestial emperor, overlooking the mountains and rivers, wouldn't that mean standing above their heads, becoming an existence that controlled their life and death? Even in the mortal world, ordinary people would not be able to accept such a thing, let alone in this world where almost everyone was a cultivator. All of them were powerful and had strong minds. How could they accept such a thing? Powerful auras burst out from all over the world, conveying all kinds of anger and warning emotions. Although these auras were extremely powerful overall, they could not be equal to each other. There was bound to be a difference in strength between them. Among them, the strongest was even close to the level of Luo Fan and the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline. Even the weakest was at the level of a supreme emperor. According to a rough estimate, there were actually hundreds of thousands of such existences in this world. Moreover, this was only the existences that emitted their auras. There were others that did not emit their auras. They were existences like Luo Fan and the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline. Who knew how many of them there were? There are actually so many experts. At this moment, Hun Ku's expression was filled with resolution. Although she had such thoughts in her heart, there wasn't the slightest fear in her heart. On the contrary, there was an eagerness in her eyes. As someone who had found her own Tao, although Hun Ku was like a child in front of Luo Fan and the Space Maiden from an alternate timeline, she was no longer a child. Since she had already set her goal, she would naturally press forward without hesitation. The altar that appeared out of nowhere did not disappear after she finished chanting. Instead, it began to wriggle and change slowly. In the end, it turned into a yellow robe that directly enveloped Hun Ku's body. The design of this yellow robe was extremely exquisite. Not only did it exude a boundless majesty, it also exuded a powerful aura of an emperor. Furthermore, it vividly displayed the charm of a woman. It was truly the perfect combination of majesty and beauty. With the yellow robe on her body, Hun Ku felt as if her strength had suddenly increased by a few hundred times. Her perception of this world seemed to have become even clearer. Everything that happened in this world had become even clearer to her. She vaguely understood where the dangers in this world were and how she should deal with them. She slowly descended from the sky and landed in the city once again. In an instant, the city's aura resonated with her. It began to wriggle and gradually change. A huge and majestic palace. It replaced the building that Luo Fan had originally set up in the northwest corner of the city. It became the most solemn and mysterious place in the city. At this moment, all the living beings in the city had a choice. 80% of the living beings directly came to the palace and began to meet the celestial emperor again. In other words, meet Hun Ku, the remaining 20% of the living beings. Without any hesitation, he turned around and left the city, heading somewhere else. Hun Ku comforted the living beings who came to meet her with gentle words. She even began to select talents, give them official positions, and issue various tasks for them to carry out. As for the living beings who left, she did not pay attention to them. Their ideals were different, so they parted on good terms. It was just that, Celestial Emperor. Looks like she has great ambition. I didn't expect her to achieve this in one go. Luo Fan smiled as he looked at all the living beings in front of him. He originally thought that what Han Ku wanted to do this time was at most to express to the world that she was willing to help the world establish order and end the chaos. She wanted to integrate civilization and form a more favorable environment. However, he did not expect that she would directly express that she wanted to become the Celestial Emperor. She wanted to directly control all the civilizations in the world and manage all the living beings in the world. She directly displayed the status that she might only obtain after tens of thousands of years. How could he not be surprised? This is what it means to be at peace, the air hostess in the alternate timeline said with a gratified expression. Hearing that, Luo Fan just smiled. He did not say anything like she was no longer peace. After all, the air hostess in the alternate timeline was just sighing inexplicably. As long as she sighed, everything would be fine. It was meaningless to continue to be entangled in this fact, although she is very bold. In this case, I'm afraid the difficulties she will encounter will be hundreds or even thousands of times more than the normal order. Luo Fan sighed. With our help, she doesn't need to be afraid no matter how many difficulties she encounters. The air hostess in the alternate timeline said lightly. Hearing that, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "With our help? Do you think we can still help her now?" Hearing that, the air hostess's expression changed slightly. She sensed carefully and suddenly showed a panicked expression. How is this possible? We are actually restricted and can't help her. What the hell is this world doing? To become the Celestial Emperor, she naturally needs to be qualified to be recognized by the world. If we help her, won't she be our puppet in the eyes of the world? Tell me, how can the world allow us to help her freely? Luo Fan sighed. In fact, he had already guessed this when Han Ku said she was going to become the Celestial Emperor. When Han Ku started to build the dynasty, he really confirmed it. The air hostess in the alternate timeline opened her mouth, but she could not refute that in the end. She was not a cultivator with shallow knowledge, and she was quite clear that what Luo Fan said was the truth. The world naturally had its rules. If one wanted to improve and grow in the rules, and finally achieve the supreme position, of course, one had to abide by the rules. Although the two of them were powerful enough to make all living creatures in this world despair, they could not challenge the rules. At this moment, Han Ku did not know that her father and mother could not help her. At this moment, she was calmly building the framework of a normal cultivation dynasty. The outline of the entire dynasty started to become clearer and clearer. The living creatures who were given official positions did not just receive a title, but also the blessing of the city's rules. In other words, they would receive the blessing of the rules of the entire dynasty, which would continue to expand in the future. The effect of this blessing was enough to allow them to do countless things that they could not normally do in the dynasty's city. In fact, some of the high-ranking officials, such as the imperial tutors and the prime ministers, could even receive the blessing of the rules and unleash power that was far greater than their own strength. This situation was naturally good news for the creatures that had joined the empire, causing them to rejoice over the fact that they had joined the empire. In just a few days, the outline of the dynasty had been truly established. Soon after, hundreds of millions of three-headed and six-armed living creatures were created. They formed an army and set off towards the various chaotic areas in this world. One had to know that the astonishing chaos caused by the descent of the rays of spiritual light from the primal chaos had yet to subside. If he didn't resolve this chaos, he wouldn't even be able to think about establishing an empire or becoming the Celestial Emperor. As for the terror of the chaos, it could be seen from the changes that the previous two chaotic areas had brought to this city. Father, mother, how did I do? After the army set off, Han Ku came to see Luo Fan and the air hostess from a different timeline. She spoke with a rare naivety. Luo Fan and the air hostess from a different timeline exchanged glances and sighed inwardly. In the end, the air hostess from a different timeline said solemnly, "You did well, but I'm afraid you will have to rely on yourself next." Chapter 1900. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face B. Hearing this, Hun Ku's expression changed greatly. "Daddy, Mommy, are you leaving me?" The Sky Maiden sighed and said, "It's not that we want to leave you. It's just that this world restricts us from taking action. Once we take action, you will be doomed and suffer the shocking backlash of becoming a celestial emperor. At that time, even we won't be able to protect you." Hearing this, Hun Ku was stunned. One of the reasons why she wanted to become a celestial emperor in one step was that she had a strong spirit. However, the other reason was that she had the support of Luo Fan and the Sky Maiden. But now, the Sky Maiden told her that one of the reasons was no longer valid. She could only rely on herself for everything from now on, whether it was life or death, whether it was success or failure. One could imagine how great the impact this situation had on her spirit was. An inexplicable sense of regret rose in her heart. At this time, she couldn't help but think that she shouldn't have directly announced that she wanted to become a celestial emperor. If that had happened, the world wouldn't have been so pressured on her. However, Hun Ku was still Hun Ku. That sense of regret didn't linger in her heart for too long. Very soon, she completely erased that sense of regret. Now that it had happened, the past couldn't be changed. Under such circumstances, what was the point of regret? Now, the most important thing was to stimulate all of her potential without the help of her parent. To complete the great cause of becoming a celestial emperor. All these thoughts flashed through her mind. Her eyes focused again and the light in them became more and more determined. Then, she said, "Mommy, don't worry. I'm fine. Next, just watch me do my best. I will definitely become a celestial emperor and let you enjoy the highest honor. You do have to do your best, but not for our honor, but to help us," Luo Fan suddenly said. "Help you?" Hun Ku's eyes lit up. Although the two of them were the first people she saw when she was born, and thus she believed that they were her parents, she felt incomparably close to them. But this didn't mean that she was willing to be a child in their eyes. It was like a child who didn't want to be a child in front of his parents forever. At this time, when he heard that he could help Luo Fan and the others after becoming a celestial emperor, her expression had already changed. The fighting spirit in her expression had increased by several folds in the blink of an eye. That kind of powerful aura surged out, vividly displaying her determination. At this moment, the eyes of the air hostess in the alternate timeline lit up. She looked at Luo Fan with admiration in her eyes. Obviously, Luo Fan's words. In her opinion, it was too wonderful. As for what Luo Fan meant by Hun Ku being able to help them, air hostess, who was in a different timeline, understood tacitly. Luo Fan nodded at Hun Ku. "Then you'll have to work hard." As he spoke, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already crossed the void and stepped into the starry sky. He arrived above the moon and sat on it, the bright moon of this world. Now, only Luo Fan, who had engraved the mark on the sky, could truly come into contact with it. Other living beings couldn't really get close to it, let alone touch it. Of course, even if it was Luo Fan, at this time, he was only in contact with the bright moon. He wasn't in the depths of the bright moon, or in other words, the world that was formed from its essence. There was a world of difference between this bright moon and an ordinary satellite. An ordinary satellite was just a small, ordinary planet. However, this bright moon was completely different. It was completely formed by the condensation of endless lunar essence. In fact, due to the extreme condensation and transformation, it finally possessed the ability to create endless lunar essence. It was because of this that there was endless moonlight radiating from it at all times, illuminating the entire world. When Luo Fan arrived here, even he felt an indescribable chill penetrating his body. When he calmed himself down, he activated his own power and isolated himself from the coldness. It should be known that Luo Fan was basically invulnerable. It went without saying how terrifying the chill was to be able to make him feel cold. It shouldn't even be an ordinary chill. It should be a chill that had completely transformed into a law. After arriving here, Luo Fan didn't build anything like a cave abode. He just quietly floated several feet above the ground and looked ahead. When he looked ahead from the bright moon, the entire world was directly imprinted in his eyes. Light could be reversed. This was true even in this world. According to this principle, one could see the bright moon from any position in this world. In that case, one would naturally be able to see any position in this world from the bright moon. His heart skipped a beat and his eyes narrowed. The city somewhere in this world grew larger and larger in his eyes. In the end, Hunku, who was in the palace, was revealed. As for the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline, she was nowhere to be found. Luo Fan searched for a bit and found her existence in the depths of this world. Looking at where she was in a place similar to the underworld. The underworld had yet to take shape, and it had not even expanded. It was like a planet that stood in the depths of the ground. It was tightly connected to all the land and sea regions in this world. It was obvious that she was observing this world in a completely different way from the bright moon. When Luo Fan saw her, she also raised her head and looked at Luo Fan. Their gazes penetrated the entire world and looked at each other from afar. They both smiled. At the same time, they dispersed their senses. Just like how Luo Fan knew what the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline was doing, the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline also knew what Luo Fan was doing. Although the two of them couldn't directly help Hunku, they were using their own methods. They were helping Hunku from the side. In fact, Luo Fan wasn't on the bright moon just to observe the changes in the world. More importantly, it was because he knew that the bright moon would cause a huge change in the world. An extremely huge change would occur, and this change would be sufficient to destroy everything in the world, causing this world to return to absolute chaos once more. Only by suppressing this place could the bright moon not go out of control. It wouldn't completely erase all of Hunku's achievements. Similar to this, the core of the underworld was very likely to erupt with a shocking change in the world. This kind of change could also turn all of Hunku's efforts into naught. An expert was needed to suppress it in order to eliminate the possibility of chaotic time and space. The suppression of these two. For Hunku, it was the most important kind of suppression. As long as the suppression of these two existed, then, in the process of Hunku becoming a heavenly emperor, she would try her best to avoid any unexpected disturbances. This was also the only thing that Luo Fan and the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline could do for her. Although this kind of help was important to Hunku, it wasn't direct help. It was only a guide for the general trend. That was why the world could let it go. After withdrawing his gaze, Luo Fan's heart moved. His power slowly seeped out of his body and carefully sensed the pulse of the bright moon. He sensed the birth of the lunar essence in the bright moon bit by bit, and he felt the entire process of the lunar essence constantly spreading across the world. If he wanted to perfectly guide it and suppress it, he naturally needed a deep understanding. At this moment, what Luo Fan was doing was understanding the bright moon. Similarly, the Sky Maiden in the alternate timeline in the depths of the earth and the core of the underworld was clearly doing something similar. However, all of this did not exist for the living beings in the world. Perhaps some living beings with powerful eyesight could see that something had suddenly appeared on the bright moon, but no one would have expected that there was actually an existence suppressing the bright moon and guiding it. At this moment, they were all acting for a single goal. That was to resist. To resist the chaos that was still ongoing due to the spiritual light that had shot in from the primal chaos state. To resist the conquest of the existence that claimed to become a heavenly emperor. Compared to the earth-shattering change that was about to occur in the world, these things were clearly more important to them. In the newly established dynasty, after Hun Ku's mentality changed, her actions became more decisive. Many of her previous decisions also changed because of this. At the very least, the three-headed, six-armed creature that had been sent out had unknowingly grown more than 10 times. It had also become more determined and faster in its transformation of the conquered land. It had also become more and more decisive in its treatment of those who resisted. Soon, as the first batch of the three-headed, six-armed creature came into contact with the rebels, a battle broke out. With the three-headed, six-armed creature's ability to replicate itself endlessly and fearlessly, it took a few days before it finally completely conquered the rebels who were originally much stronger than it. After that, the three-headed, six-armed creature directly followed Hun Ku's arrangements and began to build a city in the conquered land. With the ability of such a connate grand heavenly realm being, it would not be difficult for them to build any kind of city. It was naturally much easier to build a city that had already been designed beforehand, and was only guided by the law of receiving. In almost a few hours, a majestic city had already been built in that region. In the instant that the city was truly formed, various rules were naturally replicated from the imperial city where Hun Ku was, changing the rules and laws within the boundaries of the city into a state similar to the imperial city. That place became the birthplace of the three-headed, six-armed creature and the new foundation of the dynasty. This change caused their combat strength to increase significantly. The more they fought, the stronger they became. It was truly a classic example of nurturing battle through battle. With one city, there would naturally be a second one, a third, a fourth. After that, it could be said that a city was built almost every day. And these cities, they were not built at random. In fact, the location where each city was built had to follow some extremely mysterious and subtle rules, gradually building a certain existence in this world. Under such circumstances, the more cities were built, the blessing that the entire dynasty would receive would be greater. A year later, when the 499th city was built, every city started buzzing and emitting countless rays of light. Countless lights shot up into the sky from the city, turning into pillars of light that towered between the heavens and the earth. It was as shocking as the 499 pillars that supported the heavens. The places where these pillars of light appeared were all around the city where Hun Ku was. Every pillar of light, in other words, represented every city. All of them had an inexplicable connection with that city. This connection was originally independent. In other words, the connection between each city and the imperial city did not have much to do with the other cities. However, at this moment, the moment the 499 cities were completely built, the inexplicable existence that was originally built to build the city really played its basic role. All the connections were truly linked together. This allowed that inexplicable existence to finally take shape. At this moment, if someone were to observe this world from a position where they could observe it from a macroscopic perspective, for example, where Luo Fan was at this moment, they would see that, with the imperial city as the center, the pillars of light vaguely formed an extremely complicated and mysterious law rune. This law rune was currently emitting an indescribable power that slowly seeped into the laws of heaven and earth. It permeated the depths of this world and vaguely changed the laws of heaven and earth in that area, changing some inexplicable and mysterious existence in the depths of this world. As this happened, strands of wondrous laws appeared in this region. This kind of rule was similar to the rules within the city. However, in terms of level, it was not as absolute as the rules within the city. Moreover, the strictness of the laws was far from comparable to the laws in the city. However, the existence of such laws was enough to greatly suppress the living beings that were rejected by the imperial city and greatly reduce their strength. As a result, the living beings that were recognized by the imperial city could receive a huge boost there, and their strength would be greatly enhanced. Although Hun Ku had unreservedly revealed her goal of becoming a celestial emperor, many ambitious living beings were very repulsed. However, in this world, there were still more living beings that recognized reality. As a result, only a small portion of the conquered regions were unwilling to be under her rule, so they either resisted or fled. Most of the remaining living beings took the opportunity to join the imperial city and become its subjects. Hence, there were currently hundreds of billions of living beings living in the area surrounded by the 499 cities that Hun Ku had built. Most of these hundreds of billions of living beings were originally just muddling along and treating the imperial city as a temporary residence. They did not feel much belonging to the imperial city. In fact, they did not even think that there was any difference between surviving here and surviving in the outside world. However, at this moment, when the various subtle laws appeared within the imperial city, the many subjects of the imperial city all felt an indescribable shock. Their attitude towards the imperial city had instantly divided them into two camps. One was that their strength had greatly decreased, while the other was that their strength had greatly increased. These two differences instantly caused the many living beings to display the various forms of the mortal world. Some were extremely surprised, some were indescribably terrified, some were incomparably shocked, and some even cried out loud. However, there were also some who laughed wildly in excitement and shouted that the heavens had eyes. An uproar and chaos appeared within the boundaries of the dynasty. However, the commotion and chaos soon disappeared. What replaced it was a more stable order than before, and a clearer atmosphere than before. Sensing all of this, Hun Ku was finally convinced that the imperial city had already been established before this, although there were already many cities with various characteristics, and there were many residents among them. Many living beings admitted that these cities were extraordinary. However, all along they only acknowledged their own cities, and their sense of recognition towards the entire imperial city was rather ordinary. Until now, the entire imperial city was treated equally, and an order that could continue to develop had been established. Only then did this sense of recognition spread from the individual cities to the entire imperial city. With this recognition, the expansion of the imperial city and the conquest of the outside world became more than 100 times smoother. The reason was, of course, not because of the sense of recognition. The reason why the expansion became so smooth was that the living beings within the imperial city's territory began to join the army, and they began to join the imperial city's army, helping the imperial city to conquer and expand outwards. Under such changes, the overall combat strength of the imperial city naturally increased, so how could the conquest not be smooth? With such changes, the number of cities grew at a speed that exceeded 100 times before, and it began to change continuously. It could almost be said that it was changing every day. A year later, close to 50,000 cities were built, causing the Lorune that was originally only in its initial form to become even more intricate, and the scale also became even larger. Chapter 1901. At this moment, the range of the kingdom had already occupied a radius of several dozen light-years. Compared to the entire world, this region was naturally extremely small. In fact, it could even be considered insignificant. Phoenix quick update please search. However, this was only relative to the world itself. In fact, the range was so vast that it was enough for thousands of civilizations to develop. For a kingdom to grow to such a huge extent, the amount of resources it had and the number of living beings it could accommodate had already reached an unimaginable level. Perhaps it was because the laws within the range of the kingdom determined that battles could not erupt without restraint. As a result, the living beings within the range were sorted out. Although only a year had passed, the number of living beings within the kingdom had already multiplied by 2 or 3 times compared to before. An indescribable auspicious aura gradually spread within the range of the kingdom. The attraction to living beings in other regions also became greater and greater. Vaguely, this kingdom already had the intention of being the legitimate ruler of the world. During this year, the empire's expansion had also encountered many obstacles. The number of living beings killed during this process was calculated in the hundreds of millions. The entire empire could really be said to be filled with slaughter. Vaguely, there was an unconcealable killing intent that accumulated on the empire's luck. It was vaguely pressuring the heart of Hun Ku, who occupied the highest position in the empire and claimed to be the celestial emperor. This situation made Hun Ku feel an indescribable pressure. His comprehension of cultivation was also inexplicably affected. This was the backlash of the world, the backlash of all living beings. Hun Ku himself was rather clear about this. Hence, he did not feel any regret because of this inexplicable pressure. Instead, he pushed forward the empire's expansion even more vigorously, pushing forward the changes to the entire world. Streaks of light descended from the sky. The spiritual light that attracted the tribulations transformed into all sorts of strange existences in the world. They began to cause all sorts of mysterious changes to the world. Some caused chaos. Some caused destruction, while others caused creation. They added all sorts of sceneries and characteristics that originally did not exist in the world. In the process of the empire's expansion, it encountered many such existences. Most of the encounters. However, there were also some who coexisted peacefully. In the end, those existences were integrated into the dynasty and the country as a conclusion. Just like that, after another 3 years, the number of cities in the dynasty had increased to billions. The area it occupied had already reached an area of several million light-years. Such an area was still extremely small compared to the entire world. However, its status was much more important than before. Vaguely, the complete law rune formed by billions of cities had countless threads of law radiating from it and gradually fusing with the laws of the world, causing the laws of the world to undergo subtle changes. It was an indescribable change, and it was trying its best to change to the state of the laws of the empire. Of course, even the interior of dynasty had to rely on the law runes to form such a law. In the outside world, it was practically impossible to use the law runes to modify it. Therefore, at this moment, although the changes existed and continued, it was not worth looking forward to seeing the final result. At the center of the dynasty, in the palace in the northwest corner of the city that was 10 times larger than before, there was a palace in the imperial palace. Hun Ku was sitting on the throne in the hall. Her eyes were a little hollow, and she could vaguely see the various scenes in the billions of cities in the empire. Although only 5 years had passed, there was already a world of difference between the current her and the past her. Not only was the emperor's aura several times stronger than before, but more importantly, her cultivation realm had also increased. Back then, although Hun Ku had announced that she wanted to become a heavenly emperor, her cultivation realm had only reached the peak of lesser completion quasi-saint. Compared to some cultivators in the empire, she was much weaker. However, in just 5 years, her cultivation realm had brazenly broken through many realms and stepped into the pseudo-saint realm. Moreover, she was no longer an ordinary pseudo-saint, but a pseudo-saint who had reached the ultimate venerable realm. The leap was so great that even a rocket would not be able to reach this stage. However, such a huge improvement did not leave any signs of instability in her foundation. At this moment, the aura around her was harmonious, and her control of power and realm was subtle and profound. It had reached a stage that could not be improved anymore. Such a change was so unbelievable, but it also revealed an indescribable sense of nature. This was none other than the fact that she had gained a deep understanding of her own path of cultivation during the expansion of the dynasty over the years. As a result, her cultivation realm naturally increased, allowing her to pass through many realms and directly step into her current level. She was only a little bit away from becoming a false saint. Suddenly, Hun Ku murmured, "Next, it's time for the second step of the plan." As she spoke, various subtle changes occurred in the entire empire. Strange living beings were born out of thin air and began to head out of the empire. Almost all of these living beings were condensed from nomological laws. In essence, they were not much different from the three-headed and six-armed living beings. However, be it in terms of power composition, intelligence, or appearance, they were not much similar to the three-headed and six-armed living beings. It was as if they were all fundamentally different from the three-headed and six-armed living beings. These living beings carried the seeds of the cities and all the differences between the empire and the outside world as they headed to all parts of the world. The speed at which they were born was extremely fast. On the first day, trillions of them were born. In the following days, the number increased every single day. After a full month, the empire was faintly affected and the strength of the nomological laws seemed to have weakened a little. Only then did Hun Ku stop this action and let those living beings spread out as much as possible. Although these living beings were not considered powerful, due to the extremely mysterious composition of their power, they could vaguely receive the support of the entire empire. Therefore, they could unleash power that far exceeded their own level even though they were not too powerful. Under such circumstances, although they could not avoid all dangers, most dangers no longer posed much of a threat to them. According to Hun Ku's calculations, at least 60 to 70% of them would be able to complete her goal. The rate of loss seemed very high and seemed to be inconsistent with the fact that most dangers could not affect them, but in reality it was very normal. After all, the current state of chaos in this world caused the will of the heavens and the earth to have no choice but to help Hun Ku up. Existences at the first heaven realm and golden immortal realm encountered countless dangers, and coupled with the fact that the task Hun Ku wanted them to do was truly too complicated and dangerous. Therefore, 60 to 70% of them completing their goal was truly an astonishing achievement. After sending those living beings out, Hun Ku did not pay much attention to them. She only faintly sensed their locations. Those living beings' goals were fixed. They were all extremely far away from each other in this world. From time to time, Hun Ku could sense that a living being had suddenly encountered some sort of terror and died a violent death along with the seeds it carried. All of them collapsed and perished together. But at the same time, it would happen from time to time. There were creatures that stopped in a certain location, starting to hide themselves, entering a state of sleep, relying on their original settings to nurture that seed. Such a process. This continued for 100 years. Throughout the 100 years, Dynasty's expansion process was slightly curtailed. They spent most of their time digesting and developing their original territories. However, even so, after 100 years, the size of the entire empire had increased by more than 10 times. Although it was still extremely small compared to the world, it was no longer insignificant. Of course, it was not all the empire's expansion in the past 100 years. In fact, the entire empire had been attacked several hundred times in the past 100 years. These attacks were either from other dynasties that had been established over the years, or from powerful beings that had an absolute obsession with freedom. Every time such an attack occurred, it was a huge challenge to the entire empire. Most of the time, it required the entire empire to gather all its strength and even cause the empire to suffer heavy losses before it could be destroyed or even repelled. Under such circumstances, every time there was a few attacks, it was equivalent to a tempering of the empire, allowing the empire to move towards an even more perfect and wondrous direction. Just like that, the empire had gained an indescribable historical aura after 100 years. A pure belief gradually appeared in the empire. To the living beings in this dynasty, it was as if this dynasty had existed for millions of years, tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. An unknown number of living creatures could not even imagine what the world would be like without this empire. They could not even imagine what kind of state they would be in if they lost this empire. It was this kind of mentality that gradually affected the empire, causing the internal rules and laws of the empire to become even tighter. It also became more intimate to the living beings and more cruel to the enemies. It could be said that after all these years of development, the empire no longer needed Hanku to take any action or put in any effort for it to exist for a long time. At this point, it could even be said that Hanku was no longer in control of the empire. Instead, it was the empire that was leading her to take action. If this was Hanku's entire plan, then her plan and her efforts could be said to have been a complete failure. There was no other reason. She had established the empire to carry out her own path, but now it was the empire that was affecting her, leading her actions and holding her hostage. Wasn't this a failure? However, it was clearly true. Hanku didn't only have these plans. While doing her best to endure the entire empire holding her hostage, she worked hard to guide the living beings that she had sent out back then and planted more and more seeds in various locations in this world. These locations, all of them were exquisite and profound, and they were distributed in the various key nodes of this world. Once these seeds grew there, they would definitely cause a huge impact on the entire world. This kind of influence could be good or bad. However, no matter what, there would definitely be a huge feedback effect on Hanku. If there was positive feedback, Hanku might be able to take a huge step forward and transcend the entire empire, becoming an existence that the empire could not hold hostage. However, if there was negative feedback, then the result would obviously be the opposite. After experiencing so many years of control over the entire empire, the current Hanku's mentality and boldness were much stronger than before. This plan that she had made back then, how could she not have the courage to carry it out? On a certain day 100 years later, the moment the last living being was in place, Hanku, who was in the imperial palace, had a thought. Waves of orders spread through the world through the laws and entered the hearts of all the living beings in the various nodes. In an instant, those living beings woke up from their slumber. The seeds that had been planted in their bodies began to frantically devour everything in their bodies. Their bodies. Spirit, power, laws, these living beings were just derivatives of the laws and laws. Facing this devouring, they did not move at all, nor did they show any signs of pain. Instead, they felt comfortable, as if they had returned to their mother's embrace. Instead, they worked hard to help the seeds devour themselves, pouring everything they had into the seeds faster and faster. With this infusion, the seeds began to rapidly grow, eventually turning into balls of light that radiated boundless light from the nodes of heaven and earth. This boundless light was mysterious and wonderful. It directly fused with the laws and laws, turning into some sort of landscape in this world. It became an existence that the laws and laws could not be touched, an existence that could not be touched at all. Then, these lights began to sprout and gradually grow. In the end, countless runes that looked like leaves grew out, as well as strands of roots that seemed like laws and laws. They slowly pierced into the void, gradually spreading towards the depths of the laws and laws. At this moment, this part of the world began to tremble slightly. This kind of trembling wasn't like what had happened before, where there was an invisible hand grabbing the world and starting to shake. Instead, it was like there was something that could shake this part of the world wriggling and starting to turn over. This sort of tremor caused everyone in the area to be overwhelmed with shock. It was only 100 years. Perhaps it was a very long time for the living beings in the imperial court, but for the living beings in this world, it really wasn't a very long time. As a result, the chaos caused by the descent of the spiritual light from the sky had not completely calmed down. Although it was much better than before, under such circumstances, the first thing that came to the minds of the living beings in this world was that the chaos had escalated. It has begun. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was on the bright moon, opened his eyes and looked at the complete scene in front of him. This thought flashed through his mind. In his eyes, an unknown number of billions of light spots had appeared out of nowhere in this part of the world, and they were distributed in almost every corner of this world. The starry light spots vaguely corresponded with the stars in the void. At first glance, it was like looking at a starry sky with a different background. All the spots of light shone brightly, and they continued to expand. Strands of light swam out from those spots of light, and the area they occupied continued to expand. More and more of the world was gradually enveloped by those strands of light, and the entire world was trembling because these strands had naturally agitated the laws and laws in the surroundings, as well as the surrounding time and space. Although there were trillions of light spots, this part of the world was simply too vast. Although all the light spots were distributed in almost every area of this world, the difference between two was still extremely large. In fact, it would take hundreds of millions of light years to calculate it clearly. Under such circumstances, even if the threads extended from these light spots were trying their best to reach other light spots, it would still take tens of millions of years for these threads to connect with each other at this speed. At this moment, almost all the living beings around those light spots received a message at the same time. Do you want to become an emperor? Do you want to obtain endless blessings and break through realms that were originally impossible to break through? Among the many living beings who received the message, there was no lack of beings above the connate grand heavenly realm, and even demi-saint realm and false saint realm. However, they couldn't avoid the infusion of the message, and they couldn't resist the appearance of the message. Chapter 1902. In Luo Fan's eyes, in just a few days, the specks of light that covered the entire world seemed to have found support. They suddenly broke away from their original floating state and completely stabilized. They directly took root in that area, as if there was no longer any power that could pull them out. Seeing then, the specks of light began to grow extremely quickly. In just a few days, they had already turned into cities and began to spread their influence in the areas they were in. More and more living beings were affected by these specks of light and the cities. With Luo Fan's knowledge, he immediately knew that these seeds had clearly found a guide and were truly recognized by the living beings in that area. Only then would such a situation occur. With a thought, he completely understood everything. He could not help but wear a faint smile on his face. I didn't expect that she would actually think of such a method. It seems that she has indeed grown up. In an instant, such a thought flashed through his mind. Hun Ku's previous method was to confer titles to emperors. Around each speck of light, he would find a large number of living beings that wanted to become emperors and give them a limited ability to control the seeds. Then, with their own abilities, the seeds would truly be able to take root in that area. Then, the sprouts would turn into cities and evolve into various rules similar to the cities within the empire. They would form the base of those who wanted to become emperors, so that these living beings could use them as a foundation to continuously conquer the outside world and expand the radiation of the cities. For the Sky Emperor, having many emperors under him was not only a natural thing, but also something that was bound to happen. After all, a celestial emperor was in existence that could overlook the mountains and rivers and control the entire world. Under such circumstances, the various small matters in the world naturally needed some living beings to arrange and handle them. However, it was impossible for everything in the world to be handled by the celestial emperor himself. If that was the case, then how could the celestial emperor appear to be respected? How could he show his status? Therefore, conferring titles to some emperors that controlled small areas and controlling these emperors himself was clearly the best choice. As for why there was no such conferment of emperors before this, it was only because the territory was relatively small, and the enfeoffment would greatly weaken the power of the Sky Emperor. Things were different now. He had already spread the seeds to every corner of this world, to the point where even Hun Ku, the real celestial emperor, could not completely control it. Under such circumstances, the appointment of emperors would no longer affect his power, so it was naturally a good time to implement it. As for why those living beings would agree to this kind of enfeoffment and help Hun Ku carry out the conquest, that was even simpler. Hun Ku inquired about so many living beings. He would eventually find someone who was willing to join. With the appearance of such a change, Dynasty's conquest seemed to have been added with an accelerator. It began to proceed at a speed that was hundreds or thousands of times faster than before. Looking down from the bright moon, it was as if the radiating range of those light spots had expanded by hundreds or thousands of times. No emperor would be willing to control just a city. Even if the city was huge and powerful, it was still the same. Therefore, those cities, on the other hand, were constantly growing new seeds under the efforts of many emperor candidates and were planted in new locations. They vaguely formed a sphere of influence with the original cities. It was as if they were replicating the initial development process of the dynasty back then, and gradually built up one country after another. In the process, there was naturally no lack of obstacles. Naturally, the resulting conflict would not be small at all. The entire world. As a result, it was plunged into a quagmire of war that was even more intense than before. There was iron and blood everywhere, killing and death everywhere, and there was an indescribable vitality everywhere. At this moment, the bright moon under Luo Fan's feet began to tremble slightly. Vaguely, it seemed as if some indescribable change was occurring within it, and it began to transform the entire bright moon, transforming it into a certain state. At this moment, Luo Fan knew that it was time for him to make a move. At that moment, he slowly closed his eyes. His sense of existence began to increase, and he slowly pressed down on the bright moon. Even for Luo Fan, it was impossible to suppress all the changes of the bright moon with his own power alone. After all, the bright moon was not just an ordinary planet. There was a huge world behind it. Although the world had almost completely integrated into this world, it could not change the infinite power that it had, nor could it change the terrifying power that it possessed, which was enough to easily crush Luo Fan. Therefore, it was obvious that Luo Fan could not directly suppress the changes of the bright moon with his power. He could only use his own presence to guide the changes, causing the speed of the changes to slightly slow down, and the trend of the changes to move in the direction that he wanted. Luo Fan himself was an existence that was about to encounter the third great tribulation. His own sense of existence was much weaker than that of a true divine, but compared to the existence of a supreme emperor, he was already many times stronger. At this moment, his powerful presence formed an inexplicable resonance with the bright moon, causing the entire bright moon to tremble slightly. This trembling affected and changed the changes that were occurring within the bright moon, causing the changes within the bright moon to slightly slow down. At this moment, the boundless light in front of him that could be seen from the bright moon suddenly trembled, as if it had suddenly lightened. The strength of the expansion became more determined, and the difficulty of expansion seemed to have become smaller. It was as if some kind of shackles had suddenly been removed, allowing him to easily increase his speed to the limit. At the same time, deep underground, above the core of the underworld, the Sky Lady in a different timeline also made a move. Compared to Luo Fan's method of directly using his own sense of existence to change the bright moon, her method was not so mysterious. At this moment, countless runes appeared on her body, turning into a seven-colored light that continuously seeped into the constantly trembling world below. A space-time was brewing within the core of the underworld. As the seven-colored light seeped in, the core was gradually dyed with the seven-colored luster. The world and space-time within the core of the underworld seemed to be pulled by a hand during this process, and the evolution speed suddenly slowed down a lot. Many of the evolution processes that could have been completed in one step continued to deepen, becoming more and more detailed. However, compared to the changes in the core of the underworld, Space Maiden, who was in an alternate timeline, was trembling slightly and her face was filled with a strenuous expression. Clearly, using her own power to slow down and change the changes was not an easy task for her. For her, it was not an easy thing to do. From this aspect, it could be seen how big the gap between her and Luo Fan's means was. The resonance of the world and the transformation of the heavens and the earth were the basic principles and rules of any world. To this world, it was no exception. The various changes on the ground were naturally not limited to the ground, but they would definitely affect the entire world, including the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. They would affect the abyss of the underworld beneath the ground, as well as the rules of the birth of living beings and the characteristics of the living beings. Whether it was the changes on the bright moon or the changes under the underworld. Clearly, it was also due to the changes on the ground that were caused by the establishment of many cities. This change was due to the resonance of these changes, and it was also due to the world wanting to balance these changes. If it were not for Luo Fan and the Sky Lady in a different timeline suppressing the changes here would be as great as the changes below. And the greater the change, the more indescribable the backlash would be, acting on the source of all the changes. In other words, it was Hun Ku. At that time, forget about becoming a heavenly emperor, it was even more likely that Hun Ku would encounter an extremely absurd accident at some point in time and die a violent death. All of her great achievements would turn into nothingness overnight. In fact, even with the two of them suppressing the changes, the backlash had not been completely eliminated, and it was still continuously transmitted to Hun Ku. It was just that the speed was much smaller than normal, so she could use all kinds of means to resist it. The changes in the sky and the ground at the same time would not be too obvious to ordinary living beings. However, for Hun Ku, who had to suffer a huge impact because of these changes, she was extremely clear about it. At this moment, Hun Ku, who was cultivating in the palace, felt an indescribable intimacy from the sky and the ground. This intimacy was invisible and intangible. It was not even an aura, a temperament, or a wave. It was just a simple feeling. Under this intimacy, she vaguely felt as if she was in the arms that she had missed a lot. "Daddy, Mommy," she mumbled, and a childlike smile appeared on her face. The supreme majesty that had accumulated on her over the years did not remain on her at all. It was as if she had returned to the time when she had just been born and saw Luo Fan and the Sky Lady in a different timeline for the first time. Along with this intimacy came an indescribable sense of ease. Previously, because of her original plan, the binding that the entire dynasty had on her had been dispersed due to the sudden expansion of the dynasty, which made her feel an indescribable sense of ease. Now, coupled with this inexplicable familiarity, she felt an unprecedented comfort. At this moment, her own cultivation path became incomparably clear, incomparably clear. In a trance, the barrier between the pseudo-saint stage and the pseudo-saint stage had become completely transparent in her eyes. With just a slight movement, she had broken through it. Her cultivation realm began to increase endlessly, and in the blink of an eye, she had broken through the limit of the pseudo-saint stage. Her body and mind had merged with the fundamental rules of the entire dynasty, and she had stepped into the pseudo-saint stage. This kind of improvement instantly caused the world in her eyes to undergo an earth-shattering change. Many mysteries that she could not see or understand in the past became as clear as looking at the lines on her palm at this moment. She understood the problems that she could not think of in the past. Now it seemed to have become common sense. Moreover, apart from this, everything in the entire dynasty had become extremely clear in her heart. Her control over the dynasty. Because of this, it had increased by countless times. In the past, she needed to know certain things in the dynasty. She needed to rely on the rules that she had created back then to sense and distinguish carefully in order to be able to do so. However, at this moment, she did not need to do so at all. She only needed to think about all the changes, and she would be able to know everything clearly. The entire process was as if he was sensing his own body. Apart from this, her ability in the dynasty had become omnipotent. Even if it was someone with a higher cultivation realm than her, as long as their foundation was not in the dynasty, it would be difficult for them to hurt her. Finally, I'm one step closer. At this moment, Yi Zichen thought to himself. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Hun Ku's mind, and an indescribable joy appeared on her face. Daddy, Mommy, do you guys see this? She looked up at the bright moon in the sky, then looked down at the ground below. It was as if her gaze had penetrated the barrier of the ground and looked at the deepest part of the ground. Clearly, she had confirmed the location of Lu Fuan and the empty lady in a different timeline. That was to be expected. She had already sensed the intimacy. If she still did not know why such intimacy had appeared, she would have established such a vast dynasty for nothing. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was on the bright moon, and the empty lady, who was in a different timeline above the core of the underworld, smiled at the same time. It was as if they had heard her words. Over the next 1,000 years the world changed almost every day. The specks of light that were scattered across the world had practically occupied every single region in this world. They had already expanded to a certain extent. Originally, it would take an incomparably long period of time before they could form the many regions where they intersected. In just a short span of 1,000 years, they were already on the verge of becoming one. Now, looking down from the bright moon, there were only a few tiny gaps left between the regions, which still separated them. The entire world looked like it was squeezed together by many circular regions. The emperors of the regions had already been decided over the years. Of course, there was no need to mention the brutality, the killings, and the schemes involved in it. In the end, there was not only a single emperor. In fact, in most regions there were hundreds or thousands of emperors. Only in some regions with extremely outstanding living beings would there be an emperor candidate who would surpass all other living beings and become the absolute emperor of that region. In reality, many of the regions that had already been separated were divided again, turning into hundreds of times more regions of different sizes than before. With more emperors, there were naturally more ambitious emperors. Among the emperors that numbered in the trillions, there were naturally countless emperors who wanted to challenge Hun Ku and drag him down so that they could become the celestial emperor themselves. Among them, although there were not many living beings who had the ability to execute and put their ambitions into reality, there were still tens of thousands of them. It could be expected that even though the entire world had been completely enveloped by the huge empire, the true battle had only just begun. Although the blessing that the emperors received from the empire was bestowed by Hun Ku, after so many years of development, they had already used various methods to make this blessing their own. Not only did this blessing greatly increase their cultivation realm, but it also made this blessing an existence that even Hun Ku could not take away. This was not something inconceivable. After all, these emperors were able to stand out from the bitter battles for the throne and establish a huge country. Be it their strength or wisdom, they were absolutely extraordinary. How could they be willing to be restricted by the rules of the empire forever? As for the methods to bypass the restrictions, it was even simpler. As long as there were restrictions, there would be traces. For those emperors, as long as there were traces, they would naturally be able to find the source through various methods. It was only natural for them to bypass the restrictions. In reality, almost half of the emperors that numbered in the trillions could use certain methods to bypass some of the restrictions and shackles. There were even millions of emperors that had completely broken free from the restrictions of the empire. As for their cultivation realm, there was no need to mention it. With such a huge blessing and such a wonderful cultivation environment, even the weakest emperor was at the false saint realm. Some of the stronger ones had even reached the supreme emperor realm. Under such circumstances, they were obviously a huge threat to Hun Ku. Chapter 1903. At this moment, Hun Ku was no longer in the imperial palace. At this moment, she had already arrived at the altar where she had announced to the heavens that she would become the celestial emperor. Unknowingly, the altar had already returned to mid-air, just like a cloud in the void. At this moment, the emperor aura around Hun Ku was so strong that one could not look at her directly. The aura on her body had also increased to the point that even a pseudo-sage would not be able to control their mind if they sensed it. As for her cultivation level, she had unknowingly risen to the peak of the desperate ones. Compared to the supreme emperors, she was only a little bit away. At this moment, she was sitting on the altar as if she was in a deep sleep. Every breath she took corresponded with the entire world and the entire empire. Boundless, invisible mystical light shot towards her from various parts of the empire. In the end, it was completely injected into her body amidst all sorts of mysterious changes, causing her body to undergo indescribable changes. Moreover, her foundation was constantly being strengthened. It seems like the battle for the Heavenly Emperor is about to begin. Suddenly, Hunku opened her eyes, and a faint smile appeared on her face. Before this, all the pressure he had endured was the backlash from the entire world against the empire she had built. Therefore, although she was powerful, she did not feel too much pressure because she had the entire dynasty to share the burden. But now, the existence of this dynasty had been recognized by the heavens and earth. Naturally, there would not be any backlash from the existence of this dynasty. In that case, the pressure that constantly appeared on her was no longer targeted at the dynasty, but directly targeted at her. And the source of this pressure was none other. It was her identity as the celestial Dharch. In order to establish a dynasty that could replace the great power of the world, many would have to bear the backlash of the world. The Sky Emperor who wanted to become the ruler of this dynasty naturally had to bear the backlash of this dynasty. Hunku was no longer the naive creature that had just been born. Now that he had experienced the process of his dynasty conquering the entire world, whether it was his willpower or not, his intelligence had already reached an indescribable height. She was already very clear about all of these changes. She even had some guesses about the crucial process that would happen in the future. After that thought flashed through his mind, she did not seem to do anything, but orders were sent out continuously through the laws of the dynasty, towards the regions that were still under her control in this world. Among them, the central region, which spanned hundreds of millions of light-years, was completely under her control. Naturally, her orders would not be disregarded in the slightest. But, outside of this, the more powerful the emperor was, the greater the discount. Moreover, there were tens of thousands of regions that completely ignored her orders and completely ignored her orders. After receiving all kinds of feedback, Hunku's smile became even more obvious. Just a few orders were enough for her to figure out which areas were a threat to her, which areas posed a lesser threat to him, and which areas posed a greater threat to him, as well as which regions. This was his true enemy. As she understood this, she began to issue orders to the various regions one by one. Following her orders, the entire world started to move like a huge and delicate machine, and all kinds of indescribable actions began. Through those orders, Hunku figured out the attitude of the various regions towards her. The emperors who wanted to seize the position of the Heavenly Emperor naturally discovered her actions and understood that the real war had broken out. At that moment, the various regions also started to move. In the next 3 days, a truly grand war broke out. Among those emperors, even the most powerful emperors paled in comparison to Hunku. This point was self-evident. Under such circumstances, if those emperors wanted to overthrow Hunku and replace her, the first thing they had to do was naturally to strengthen their own strength and expand their sphere of influence. This could only be done from the surrounding regions. In other words, they had to conquer the surrounding regions. Waves of killing intent surged out from all over the world during this process, gradually accumulating in the sky. This caused the entire sky to become darker and darker, more and more oppressive. Millions, tens of millions, and even hundreds of millions of living beings died. The earth was constantly being shattered in this battle, but it was constantly being restored and reborn under the laws of the dynasties. Battle cries, furious roars, mournful wails, cheers, loud laughter, and so on rang out from every corner of the world. Through the laws of the dynasty that had been largely linked together, the entire world continued to spread throughout the dynasty, which was to say the entire world. Although Hun Kuo was the strongest, she was too far away from the regions of those emperors, and she was besieged by almost all the emperors who wanted to resist. Therefore, even though she was continuously subduing other regions and subduing the neighboring emperors one by one, adding regions after regions into her direct empire, the speed of her expansion was much slower than the rebellious empires. In the end, after an extremely tragic 100 years of battle, the overall situation of the world barely stabilized. The world had become a situation where a dynasty and nearly 100,000 empires shared the world. That dynasty was naturally the dynasty controlled by Hun Kuo, the dynasty controlled by the celestial Dharch. The nearly 100,000 empires were the massive empires formed by the many powerful emperors who had gone through repeated conquest, slaughter, and ups and downs. The world was so vast that even if it was calculated in terms of billions of light-years, it would still require billions of people to clearly describe it. Even if such a world was divided into 100,000 empires, the size of each empire would exceed the imagination of all living beings. The size of each empire was beyond the imagination of all living beings. At the very least, it was definitely not a wrong description to think of them as endless empires, although the situation of these empires had generally stabilized. However, their strength was not the same. In fact, there were strong and weak ones among them. The gap between the strongest and the weakest was like the distance between heaven and earth. If they were to go head-to-head, the strongest would definitely be able to crush the weakest with ease. The reason why such a gap could be stabilized and the strongest would not annihilate the weakest was also very simple. It was precisely because of the use and coercion of various situations. Among the many empires and dynasties, the strongest one with the widest area was naturally Hun Kuo's dynasty. This dynasty, the area it occupied was 1/20th of the entire area of the world. Although this seemed to be a very small proportion, if it was compared to the huge number of the 100,000 empires, it could already be seen how large the proportion was and how terrifying it was. Compared to the 100,000 empires, even the largest empire could only cover 1/5 of this huge area. Just from this area alone, one could already see the extent of the gap in strength. Because of this difference in strength, the 100,000 empires had already formed an alliance together against the dynasty. In the past 100 years, although this world had experienced such a tragic battle, and the number of living beings that had died could almost replace all the living beings in this world. However, more living beings were born. Now, after experiencing such a huge scale of tragic war, the number of living beings in this world had increased. The number of living beings in this world didn't decrease, but instead increased. Instead, it was nearly twice as many as 100 years ago. As for the state of the world, needless to say, there was no need to mention it. With the constant repair and replenishment of the dynasty's rules, although the terrifying and violent surges of power were enough to completely shatter the entire world several times, the world still seemed to be intact. Apart from the countless battlefields, there were no scars at all from this point of view. The establishment of the dynasty was already an enhancement to the world's ability to withstand war, which was enough to move any living being. On this day, in the starry sky of this world, an extremely mysterious world floated among the stars. Apart from the basic rules that maintained the stability of this world, there were no other power rules or cultivation rules in this world. At this very moment, the world was densely packed with living beings. Among these living beings, every single one of them had an extremely powerful and terrifying aura. In fact, a small portion of the living beings that were clearly much stronger than the other living beings were filled with a strong emperor's dignity. It was as if they were emperors and overlords that controlled all lives. The densely packed living beings were divided into close to 100,000 camps, each occupying a region. They seemed to be on guard against each other, but they also seemed to be relying on each other. It was very strange, but also very mysterious. It formed an indescribably fragile balance. Your Majesties, it's already the most dangerous time. Are you still not willing to put aside your prejudices and be honest with each other? A voice spread throughout the world. It was a 3-meter-tall humanoid creature. The aura emanating from this creature was that of a supreme emperor. Even in this world filled with countless experts, it was still considered one of the strongest existences. At this moment, the area he occupied was also close to the center of this world. Around him, there were almost the largest number of living beings in this world guarding him. Among these living beings guarding him, there were not many weaklings. Almost every one of them was a false sage existence, and this was almost comparable to some of the living beings in this world with the dignity of an emperor. The many living beings here were the emperors and their subordinates of the 100,000 empires. They were gathered here to conduct a meeting of their entire alliance against the enemy. Of course, the many emperors here were not in their actual bodies, but merely projections. Only those subordinates were in their actual bodies. As for why they needed their actual bodies to guard these projections, the reason was very simple. Even if they were captured by their opponents, it would still be extremely dangerous. It was very likely that their actual bodies would be threatened. Even if the possibility was not high, it was enough for these emperors with unlimited power to treat it as the greatest danger. Your Majesty, there's no need to be alarmist. The current situation is already clear, and there will be a long period of balance. What is the most dangerous period? Not far away, an emperor said. This emperor looked like a gorilla, and there were layers of flames burning and swaying all over his body. He looked more like a spirit in the flames. This emperor's words were echoed by many emperors. Obviously, many emperors thought the same way. Short-sighted. The Shura emperor scolded at this moment. This scolding instantly made the gorilla-like flame living being's expression change drastically. It also made the other living beings' expressions turn ugly. Everyone here was an emperor, and their words carried enormous weight. Usually, others would tremble in fear when speaking to them, worried that any words would make them unhappy. Now they were being scolded so rudely. That feeling was enough to make their anger break through their rationality. Stability? Have you never thought that if this situation continues to develop, will it affect the heavenly Dharch? Will it affect the heavenly Dharch in any way? Don't use your worldview to measure the heavenly Thearcha's mentality, the Shura emperor said coldly. His voice was like thunder, instantly exploding in this area, causing the other living beings' expressions to change drastically. They had to admit that the Shura emperor's words made sense. The heavenly Dharch didn't completely control the world. How could he call himself the heavenly Dharch? Therefore, to these emperors, although they weren't satisfied with the current situation, it was still acceptable. But, to the heavenly Dharch, this was completely different. If this situation continued, it would be equivalent to continuously extracting the foundation of his existence and continuously removing his position as the heavenly Dharch. In the long run, once this foundation was extracted to a certain limit, the backlash of the world would be enough to completely erase the concept of his existence. With such a result, how could the Sky Emperor allow the situation to continue like this? However, even the cognition planted by ordinary people was difficult to eradicate. The prejudice in the hearts of these unimaginably high living beings would only be even more difficult to eradicate. Therefore, even though they knew that the Shura Emperor's words made sense, most emperors still insisted on their own ideas and their judgment of the situation. Once they believed in their judgment, they would naturally come up with countless reasons to support it. Furthermore, these beings were all at extremely high levels, so the reasoning that they came up with was extremely reasonable. If it was someone else, even if they knew that they were right, there was a high chance that they would be convinced by their reasoning and abandon what they knew to be right in favor of a reason that they didn't know was right or wrong. However, it was obvious that the people here weren't ordinary people, therefore, a quarrel was unavoidable. Fortunately, there were no rules of power or cultivation rules in this area, so the arguments of such powerhouses didn't cause any overly intense phenomena. At most, there were flashes of shadows, lightning flashes, and thunder rolls for existences at this level with unlimited energy. It was very normal for them to argue without rest. Thus, they spent the next month quarreling. In the end, what broke their bickering was the dozens of emperors and their guards suddenly dying as they let out a scream. The living beings here all had extremely sharp senses and shocking intelligence. In that instant, they already knew what was going on. This was the Celestial Emperor starting a war and completely conquering the empires of the dozens of emperors in a short period of time, completely wiping out the physical bodies of the dozens of emperors. In that instant, all the arguments from before became meaningless. Waves of divine sense spread among the emperors, and they started to discuss ways to unite and deal with the situation at an extremely fast speed. Only a few hundred emperors looked as if they had lost their parent. Without saying anything, they turned around and left this area. They were the emperors whose territories bordered the territories of the dozens of emperors. They were also the emperors whose territories were near the Celestial Empire and were used as a buffer layer. The other emperors didn't care about their departure at all. They just continued to discuss and bring out results. The reason why they did this was because they were completely convinced that the hundreds of emperors were dead for sure indeed, just as the emperors had predicted. The hundreds of emperors did not even have time to leave the world before they were destroyed along with their subordinates, and they disappeared without a trace. Only one or two of them barely managed to step out of this area before they collapsed and died a violent death in the starry sky. Their deaths instantly made the many emperors, who had expected this, feel even more anxious. The discussion that had been going on for a month without any progress had come to a conclusion in just a short period of time.